What if the oldest stories of humanity were not simply explaining the gods, but remembering a moment when the gods began to lose control? Somewhere inside the broken clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath museum glass and excavation dust, there is a strange pattern. The divine beings are not always calm. They are not always distant. They complain, argue, assign labor, make plans, reverse those plans, and sometimes seem surprised by the behavior of the humans they have made. That is the quiet problem. When modern historians, Assyriologists, and archaeologists read these tablets, they treat them with care. They are ancient literature, temple tradition, royal ideology, and fragments of religious imagination. Many lines are damaged, many names are uncertain, many tablets are copies of older stories written down centuries after the first telling. Yet even through those cracks, something curious remains. The Anunnaki, those great divine figures of Sumerian and Akkadian tradition, often appear less like unreachable spirits and more like rulers managing a complicated world, and the world does not always obey. You begin with clay because clay is what survived. Not paper, not memory, not the breath of the first singers. Clay, pressed by reed styluses, dried in the sun, hardened by accident, buried under ruined walls, then lifted much later by hands that did not speak Sumerian. Each tablet is a small fossil of thought. Each broken edge is a reminder that human history is partly made from what refused to dissolve. In the quiet rooms of great museums, these tablets look almost humble, brown, cracked, sometimes no larger than a hand, but they carry the weight of old cities: Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Shuruppak, names that sound like stones dropped into deep water. In their signs are lists of kings, hymns to gods, accounts of grain, temple offerings, laments for destroyed cities, and stories about how humans came to exist. The accepted historical picture is already astonishing enough. By the late 4th millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamia had produced some of the earliest known cities, writing systems, bureaucracies, and monumental temples. People built mud brick platforms, tracked barley, sealed jars, measured fields, and organized labor under institutions that were both economic and sacred. The temple was not only a place of prayer, it was a storehouse, workshop, archive, and center of power. That alone is not a mystery in the loud sense. It is the slow, difficult work of archaeology. But the myths placed beside those records create a different kind of unease. In the myths, civilization does not simply grow from human effort. It descends, is granted, is assigned, or is controlled by divine powers. Humans receive roles. Cities receive patron gods. Kingship comes down from heaven. Sacred laws of order, sometimes called the Pamyams, seem to govern the arts of civilized life. One cautious reading might say this is how early societies expressed authority. Divine order made earthly institutions feel permanent. Another reading, more speculative but persistent in modern imagination, wonders whether these myths preserve a memory of guidance, intervention, or an older system whose builders were later remembered as gods. The evidence remains incomplete. That is important. You're not asked to believe every strange interpretation. You're only invited to notice the texture of the old stories. The gods do not seem entirely carefree. They must organize. They must command. They must divide duties. They must respond when things go wrong. And things do go wrong. In one famous Mesopotamian tradition, preserved most fully in later Akkadian form, the gods create humans to relieve divine labor. The lesser gods have grown weary of work. Canals must be dug. Earth must be managed. Burdens must be carried. Humanity enters the story not first as a crowned masterpiece, but as a solution to a labor problem. It is a practical beginning, almost uncomfortably practical. There is a strange chill in that. The creator does not appear only as an artist. The creator appears as an administrator solving a crisis. A workforce is needed. A new being is made. The world continues. For a bedtime story, that is not exactly comforting. But it is quietly revealing. It suggests that early Mesopotamian imagination did not always picture humans as the center of the universe. Humans were necessary, useful, noisy, fragile, and eventually troublesome. In the Atrahasis story, humanity multiplies and becomes loud enough to disturb the gods. The complaint is not framed as moral rebellion at first. It is almost domestic. The divine realm cannot sleep. This is one of those small tablet details that catches in the mind, not because it proves some hidden history, but because it feels oddly human. The gods create help, then become overwhelmed by the consequences. The system solves one problem and produces another. A creation meant to reduce disorder begins generating disorder of its own. You can almost hear the reed stylus scratching that idea into damp clay. Now the ancient setting begins to gather around you. The air grows warm. The Euphrates moves somewhere beyond the reed beds, slow and brown under a pale sky. Mud brick walls hold the heat of the day. In a temple courtyard, incense smoke mixes with the smell of bitumen, wool, baked bread, and wet clay. A scribe bends over a tablet, pressing wedge after wedge into the soft surface. He is not trying to entertain you. He is preserving a world. Maybe he copies an older tablet. Maybe he learns from a teacher. Maybe he belongs to a school where myths, signs, lists, and rituals are repeated until memory becomes discipline. Outside, sandals scrape on packed earth. Inside, the signs accumulate. The Anunnaki move through these records as a group of great gods, though their exact identity shift across periods and texts. Sometimes they are associated with high divine authority. Sometimes they stand in contrast to other divine groups. Sometimes later readers imagine them as a council, a ruling class of heaven and earth. The scholarly picture is careful and complex. The popular picture is far more dramatic. Between those pictures lies the sleeping mystery. It may be that the Anunnaki stories reflect nothing more than divine politics, priestly tradition, and the structure of ancient temple society. That is already meaningful. But some have wondered whether the repeated language of assignment, descent, authority, and control hints at an older memory transformed by myth. Not a clean record, not a secret manual, more like a dream of administration surviving after the office has burned. You move slowly through that possibility. No need to hurry. The tablets themselves never hurry. They wait in fragments. One broken line says too little. Another says almost too much. A king reigns for an impossible span. A god grants a city its destiny. A flood interrupts the human story. A survivor hears a warning that perhaps he should not have heard. The pattern is not proof. It is a mood formed from many pieces. The central question settles quietly now. If Mesopotamian records remember gods who created humans for a purpose, then complained about them, punished them, spared them, and reorganized the world around them, are these stories only sacred explanations of life under authority? Or do they preserve, in symbolic form, a deeper anxiety? That humanity was once imagined as a creation that exceeded the design placed upon it. The safest answer remains humble. These are myths, written by humans, shaped by cities, priests, politics, and memory. But myths do not become powerful by being empty. They endure because they carry human questions in forms older than philosophy. And here the question is soft but unsettling. What happens when the created thing begins to make too much noise? The river keeps moving in the dark. The clay cools beneath the scribe's palm. Somewhere in the deep past, a story is being pressed into shape, not as a warning shouted across time, but as a quiet record of discomfort. The gods made order. Humanity entered it. Then the order began to tremble. The first thing you notice about Mesopotamian gods is that they often seem to have jobs, not vague qualities, not distant clouds of sacred feeling, but responsibilities. One god watches over wisdom and deep waters. Another holds authority over storms. Another guards the storehouse of fertility, battle, love, and royal power. A goddess may belong to one city, yet reach beyond it. A god may rule from a temple, yet act through kings, priests, omens, and offerings. This is not strange once you understand the world that shaped these stories. Southern Mesopotamia was a land of coordination. The rivers gave life, but never politely. The Tigris and Euphrates could nourish fields, shift channels, flood unpredictably, and leave settlements struggling against silt, drought, and distance. To live there, people needed canals, levees, labour teams, storehouses, calendars, measurements, and agreements. Civilization was not a decoration. It was a survival system, so it makes a quiet kind of sense that the gods were imagined through order. You walk in thought through a temple complex in an early city. The walls are sun-baked mud brick. The air smells of grain dust, wool, oil, and the faint sweetness of incense. Workers carry baskets. Scribes sit near the administrative rooms with damp tablets ready. Sealed jars wait in shadow. Sheep move somewhere beyond the courtyard, restless and soft-footed. Here, the sacred and practical are not separate. A temple does not merely receive prayers, it receives barley. It stores textiles. It assigns labour. It records offerings. It sends goods outward and pulls goods inward. It binds a community around a divine household, where the god is treated almost as a great landowner whose invisible presence still requires meals, garments, music, buildings, and staff. That detail matters because it changes the feeling of the myths. When the gods gather in council, divide powers, assign destinies, or complain about labour, they are not behaving randomly. They reflect a world where authority works through offices, duties, seals, rations, and written records. Heaven resembles the temple, and the temple resembles heaven. Still, the resemblance raises a small question. Did humans imagine divine administration because they lived under human administration? Or did they organize human administration because they believed the cosmos itself operated that way? Scholars can argue carefully in both directions. The evidence is layered. Myths are preserved in later copies. Ritual practices change across centuries. Cities rise, decline, and inherit one another's gods. The clay does not answer everything. In Sumerian tradition, the great gods could be described as if they formed a hierarchy. Anu was associated with the high heaven. Enlil became a powerful authority tied to command, wind, and kingship. Enki, later called Ea in Akkadian, was linked with wisdom, craft, magic, and the subterranean fresh waters called the Abzu. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was a force of desire, conflict, and dangerous brilliance. None of these figures fits neatly into one modern category. They are not superheroes, they are not symbols only, they are not merely natural forces wearing names. They are divine personalities shaped by ritual, city identity, political memory, and storytelling. And yet, they often act like managers of a world already in motion. That is one of the quiet attention sparks in Mesopotamian mythology. The gods do not create a simple garden and then rest forever. They preside over a busy system. They hold meetings. They make decrees. They assign the me, those mysterious powers or ordinances of civilization. They choose kings. They send dreams. They interpret omens through priests. They accept offerings, then may abandon cities when angered or withdrawn. There is a strange bureaucracy in the sacred. This does not mean the myths are literal reports. A careful listener should not rush there. But the administrative texture is real. Ancient Mesopotamian religion developed inside societies where writing, labour, taxation, temple economy, irrigation, and kingship were deeply linked. It is natural that divine stories would speak in the language of command and responsibility. But the Anunnaki mystery grows from that same texture. In later imagination, the Anunnaki are sometimes pictured as a council of powerful beings shaping humanity from above. Popular theories stretch them into visitors, engineers, or rulers from beyond the known world. Mainstream scholarship does not accept such claims as historical fact. The tablets do not provide clean evidence for machines from the stars or a documented non-human civilization. They provide myths, hymns, lists, and rituals. But even if you set the dramatic theories aside, the older material remains fascinating. The gods create or authorize systems that humans must live inside. Then humans begin participating in those systems with increasing skill. They write, they count, they build, they make contracts, they organize kingship, they preserve divine names in archives that outlast cities. A created servant becomes a record keeper, a labourer becomes a scribe, a worshipper becomes the guardian of divine memory. That transformation is not a rebellion with weapons. It is quieter. It is the slow transfer of order into human hands. The temple may belong to the god, but the tablet is pressed by a person. The hymn praises heaven, but the signs are learned in a school. The king claims divine favour, but the inscription depends on human craft. If the gods rule through records, then humans become necessary to the machinery of rule. This is where the idea of control becomes more delicate. In many ancient societies, divine authority strengthened human authority. Kings could claim that they were chosen, supported, or commanded by gods. Temples could preserve ritual order. Scribes could make power legible. Yet the same process also preserved doubt, failure, and divine frustration. The tablets did not only record triumph, they recorded laments, disasters, arguments, and uncomfortable memories. A city could be favoured, a city could fall, a god could protect, a god could leave. In Mesopotamian laments, destroyed cities are not described only as military losses, they are cosmic injuries. The divine presence withdraws, the temple falls silent, the streets empty, the normal order collapses like a roof after rain. The grief is political, religious, and deeply human all at once. Such texts create an open scholarly uncertainty. Were these laments primarily ritual responses to historical destruction, shaped to help communities process trauma? Were they theological explanations for why sacred cities could suffer? Or did they preserve older patterns of thought in which civilization itself was fragile because divine administration could fail? The answer may be all of these at once. You can almost feel the ancient mind trying to make sense of collapse. If the gods run the world, why does the city burn? If the temple is the center of order, why does disorder enter its gates? If humans were created to serve, how do they become kings, conquerors, builders, rebels, mourners, and chroniclers? The gods may command the system, but humans live inside every crack of it. The curious fringe tidbit appears gently here, not as a claim, but as a shadow. Some modern readers have noticed that these divine roles sometimes resemble departments of a vast project: water management, fertility, kingship, craft, warfare, writing, destiny. They wonder whether myth is remembering a structured intervention in human development. Perhaps the gods, in that reading, are memories of beings who organized early civilization. A cautious reading pulls back. More likely, the stories reflect how city people understood power. They saw the world through households, labour, irrigation, temples, and rulers. The gods became the largest version of what society already knew. But a question remains in the quiet space between those explanations. Why do the stories so often make the gods responsible for systems that humans eventually learn to operate themselves? The night deepens around the temple. A lamp trembles near a clay shelf. Somewhere, a priest recites names that have already survived longer than the walls around him. A scribe copies a sign for lordship, another for heaven, another for command. His fingers are stained with wet clay. He serves the gods by writing them down. And perhaps that is the beginning of the loss. Not a battle, not a revolt, not thunder over the city. Just a human hand learning the grammar of divine order, one careful wedge at a time. By the time the clay speaks of human beginnings, the story has already become strangely practical. You're not standing at the edge of a perfect paradise. You're standing near canals, fields, and work songs, where the earth must be cut open so water can reach the barley. The old Mesopotamian imagination does not always begin humanity with innocence. It often begins with need. Someone must carry the burden. In the Euphrates tradition, known from Akkadian tablets but rooted in older Mesopotamian ideas, the world before humanity is not empty. The gods already exist. Their hierarchy already has tension. The lower gods perform exhausting labour for the higher gods, digging canals and maintaining the ordered earth. They grow tired. They complain. Eventually, their unrest rises into open refusal. That is the first quiet surprise. Humans are created not because the universe lacks beauty, but because divine workers have reached their limit. The problem is labour. The solution is a new being. The text imagines creation almost as administrative reform, a reorganization after the workforce becomes unbearable. You can picture the scene without making it too sharp. A divine council gathers in the hush of myth. The old powers confer. Enlil's authority weighs heavily over the story. Enka, wise and subtle, becomes central to the making of humankind. The mother goddess, often associated with birth and formation, gives shape to the plan. Clay is mixed with something sacred, something living, something that binds the new creature to both earth and God. The image is simple but not small. Clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia. It made walls, bowls, tablets, seals, toys, bricks, and memories. To say that humans came from clay was not only poetry, it placed humanity inside the material of daily life. You're made of the same substance that holds a house together, records a debt, receives a prayer, and seals a jar of grain. The creation is humble, it's also useful. Mainstream scholars usually read this story through the world that produced it. In an irrigation society, labour was central. Canal digging, field maintenance, grain distribution, and temple service shaped daily existence. The myth gives cosmic meaning to a social reality. Work is not accidental. It is woven into the origin of humankind. Yet there is a strange discomfort in the way the story frames human purpose. Humanity enters as relief for divine exhaustion. People are not first described as rulers of creation, but as replacements in a system already strained. The new beings inherit work that even gods found heavy. That is not a loud claim. It is a quiet bruise in the myth. A cautious reader might say the story explains why humans must labour. A more speculative reader wonders whether it preserves a memory of being assigned into civilization, rather than freely arriving there. Some fringe interpretations go further, imagining the creation scene as a coded memory of engineering, modification, or controlled breeding. Those ideas are popular in certain modern circles, but the tablets do not provide scientific evidence for them. Still, the myth does describe a designed function. That is where the unease rests. In the old story, humanity is created with a purpose placed upon it. The gods need service. The world needs maintenance. Temples need offerings. Fields need workers. the divine household needs food, songs, and order. Human existence is tied to responsibility before it is tied to freedom. You walk deeper into that thought under the pale heat of noon. The mud brick city shimmers. A canal smells of wet reeds, fish, and river mud. Men bend to clear silt. Women grind grain in courtyards. Donkeys shift under loads. Children learn by watching older hands. No one here needs a myth to know that life is work. But myth gives the work a cosmic shadow. The tablets do not survive as complete, untouched messages from the beginning. They are copies, school texts, literary compositions, and inherited traditions. Their dates, versions, and meanings require careful study. Some passages are broken. Some names change. Sumerian and Akkadian traditions overlap, borrow, translate, and reshape one another across centuries. This uncertainty matters because it prevents easy answers. We cannot simply open a tablet and read a single original doctrine about human creation. We find layers. We find scribes preserving traditions already old to them. We find stories that were copied because they still mattered. And perhaps that is enough. The attention peak arrives in the body of the story itself. The gods create humans to relieve labour, but the act of creation does not end tension. It transfers tension. Work moves from one class of beings to another. A divine complaint becomes a human destiny. That is a remarkable pattern. The system solves its immediate problem, yet it also creates a new centre of pressure. Humans can work, but humans can also multiply. Humans can serve, but they can also build. Humans can feed temples, but they can also gather in cities large enough to produce new kinds of noise. At first, the created beings may seem manageable. They have bodies, they tire, they depend on harvests, rain, irrigation, and storehouses. Their lives are short compared with gods. Their cities can be broken, their kings die. Their names vanish unless someone writes them down. But writing changes everything. A worker obeys for one lifetime. A written system can remember for many lifetimes. A temple account can outlive the accountant. A hymn can outlive the singer. A myth can outlive the city whose god it praised. If the gods made humans to carry burdens, they also made beings capable of carrying memory. The older you sit with this idea, the stranger it becomes. There is no need to imagine sudden revolt. The transformation may be slower, almost invisible. Humans begin as hands in the divine economy, then become voices within it. They shape the stories explaining their own existence. They copy the names of the gods. They preserve divine decisions in human archives. They turn obedience into literature. The gods may have ordered humanity into being, but humans become the ones who keep the order legible. A scholarly debate lingers around how much these myths reflect everyday institutions. Were creation stories primarily theological explanations for temple labour and human service? Were they literary meditations on suffering, hierarchy, and the burden of civilization? Were they inherited from oral traditions reaching back into pre-literate memory? Each possibility changes the mood of the clay. The myth never becomes one thing only. You feel the evening settle across the fields. The canal workers return under a copper sky. Their shoulders are dusted with dried mud. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Somewhere inside the city, an apprentice presses a creation story into clay, perhaps not thinking of rebellion at all. He may only be practicing signs. He may only be copying what the teacher has set before him. Yet the signs preserve a troubling arrangement. The gods had work. The gods grew tired. Humans were made to take the burden. And once the burden entered human hands, it did not remain simple. It became farming, ritual, kingship, writing, memory, complaint, and longing. It became civilization itself, heavy and magnificent, like a basket of wet clay carried through the dark. The trouble begins not with evil but with sound. That is one of the strangest things about the old Mesopotamian story. Humanity does not first disturb the divine world by building a weapon, breaking a sacred law, or storming the gates of heaven. In the Atrahasis tradition, the humans multiply, and their noise becomes unbearable. The earth is full of their clamour. The gods cannot rest. You let that detail settle slowly. Noise is ordinary. Noise is life-filling space. Noise is children crying near doorways, tools striking wood, animals lowing in pens, grinding stones turning before sunrise, workers calling across canals, merchants disputing measures, priests chanting in courtyards, and families speaking through thin mud-brick walls after dark. To a city, noise means survival. To the gods, in the myth, it becomes a problem. The complaint sounds almost domestic, and that is what makes it so memorable. The divine order created humans to carry labour, but the new beings do not remain a quiet workforce. They become a population. They become towns, households, fields, disputes, births, festivals, markets, and funerals. Their usefulness expands into presence. Their presence expands into pressure. A created solution begins to fill the world. Mainstream readers often see this as a mythic way of discussing population growth, social strain, disease, famine, and flood. Ancient Mesopotamia knew how fragile settlement could be. Too many people in one place meant greater need for food, water, coordination, and ritual protection. Irrigation helped life flourish, but it also demanded constant maintenance. If canals failed, fields suffered. If harvests failed, temples and households felt the wound together. So the divine complaint may reflect a human anxiety about crowded life. Yet the language of the myth leaves a curious aftertaste. The gods do not simply say that humanity has sinned. They say humanity has become loud. Their creation has exceeded the peaceful limits expected of it. That does not sound like a simple moral failure. It sounds like a system generating more activity than its rulers can tolerate. It is a quiet spark in the clay. You are now in a city at night. The heat has softened, but the walls still breathe warmth. Oil lamps flicker behind doorways. Dogs bark beyond the alleys. Insects tremble in the reeds near the canal. Somewhere, a woman sings a child asleep. Somewhere else, a tablet is counted, checked, and stored. The city does not become silent just because the sun has gone. It murmurs in its sleep. Imagine a divine ear listening from far above, not hearing one voice, but thousands. The myth turns that crowd into cosmic disturbance. Human life becomes so dense that heaven reacts to it. This is not a modern scientific observation. Of course, it is a religious story, but stories reveal what cultures feared and measured. Mesopotamian cities depended on order, yet they lived near disorder every day. Floods could come at the wrong season. Salt could gather in fields and weaken crops. Political rivals could seize a city. Disease could pass through crowded quarters. A temple could lose its wealth, a king could fail, a canal could silt up. The margin between civilization and collapse was never as wide as a palace inscription wanted it to appear. In that setting, the story of divine irritation becomes more than a strange complaint. It becomes a meditation on scale. A small number of humans can serve. A great number of humans can overwhelm. A settlement can be governed. A civilization can become unpredictable. This is where some speculative readers pause. They ask whether the myth might preserve a memory of a creation project that expanded beyond its intended boundaries. Not in the sense of a proven event. The tablets cannot carry that burden. But as a symbolic pattern, it is compelling. Make beings to perform work. Watch them multiply. Discover that labourers have become a force. A careful approach keeps both feet on the earth. The old scribes were not writing modern science fiction. They were preserving inherited religious literature within their own worldview. Their gods embodied power, nature, institution, and mystery at once. Their stories explained why humans suffer, why floods come, why offerings matter, and why the divine world remains uneasy. Still, the question remains restful and unsettling. Why does the myth imagine humanity becoming intolerable through abundance? There are scholarly uncertainties here. Some debate how older Sumerian themes relate to the Akkadian Atrahasis version. Some ask how oral traditions changed before being written. Some compare the Mesopotamian flood and creation material with later Near Eastern traditions, noting similarities without pretending they are identical. The tablets preserve versions, not a single frozen original. The record is layered like mud after river waterfalls. You might picture a scribe copying a line about human noise in a schoolroom. He knows the phrase matters because his teacher corrects the sign. He may not be thinking of population pressure or cosmic anxiety. He may simply know that the old story says the gods could not sleep. Around him, other students scratch out lists of signs, names of trees, names of stones, names of professions. The sound in the schoolroom becomes part of the irony. Humans are noisy even while preserving the complaint against human noise. There is mild humour there, gentle and ancient. If the gods wanted quiet, they chose an unusual species to create. Humans talk, count, argue, sing, bargain, mourn, ask questions, and invent reasons to keep asking. Even their sleep is surrounded by stories. The myth then moves toward attempts to reduce humanity. In the Atrahasis tradition, the divine response comes through measures of suffering, plague, drought, famine, and eventually flood. These are not casual details. They reflect real fears in ancient agricultural life. Lack of water, crop failure, and disease were not abstractions. They were the edge of the known world pressing inward. Here the attention peak is not the disaster itself, but the pattern. The gods do not immediately erase humanity. They try stages of control. Pressure is applied. Relief is sought. The human problem is managed, not simply ended. That makes the divine administration feel even more like a strained system. It tries one correction, then another, as if creation has become an equation that no longer balances. The old story becomes strangely procedural. This is why the theme of lost control grows quietly from within the tablets, rather than being forced upon them. A creation that functions perfectly would not require repeated intervention. A workforce that remains obedient would not become cosmic noise. A stable order would not need cycles of correction. But the Mesopotamian imagination rarely gives you perfect stability. It gives you rivers that shift, cities that fall, gods that argue, kings that boast against time, scribes who copy broken memories from older clay. It gives you order as something constantly made, constantly repaired, constantly threatened by the life it organizes. You stand again near the canal at night. The water makes a low sound against the bank. The city settles but never fully quiets. Behind a wall, someone coughs. A child stirs. A donkey stamps in dust. A priest lamp burns late in a temple room, where offerings are checked against lists and names are kept in order. Above all this, the old story imagines divine rest disturbed. Not by a monster, not by an army, by humanity becoming too much of itself. The thought is small enough to fit on a tablet and large enough to trouble an empire. If the gods created humans to ease a burden, they may have discovered that life does not remain within the shape assigned to it. It multiplies, speaks, remembers, and fills the night with sound. The names of the first kings arrive like footsteps from a place where ordinary time has broken. You find them not in a single smooth story, but in a strange list of rulerships, cities, dynasties, and impossible spans of years. The Sumerian king list is one of the most curious documents from ancient Mesopotamia. because it tries to organize the past as if kingship had a track, a route, a movement across sacred cities. Kingship descends from heaven, then it rests in one city, then another. At first, the list feels administrative. A city name appears, a ruler follows, a reign is counted. Then the next name arrives. This is the kind of ordering a scribe would understand. History becomes sequence. Power becomes record. The past becomes something that can be held in rows. But then the numbers begin to grow strange. Before the flood, some kings are said to reign for tens of thousands of years. Alulim, associated with Eridu in the list, rules for an enormous span. Other names follow with reigns that feel less like human lifetimes and more like monuments carved out of myth. These numbers are not treated by modern historians as literal biography. They belong to the symbolic world of early kingship, sacred antiquity, and legendary memory. Still, they do something powerful. They stretch the human past until it almost stops being human. The mainstream view is careful. The Sumerian king list blends historical dynasties with legendary rulers and ideological claims. It was likely used to present kingship as a single institution that moved by divine will from city to city. It gives order to political memory, especially in a land where rival cities competed for legitimacy. To say kingship descended from heaven was to place royal authority inside cosmic structure. That does not make the list simple. You walk through the thought slowly, as if passing along shelves of tablets in a dim archive. The air is dry. A faint smell of clay dust and old wood lingers in the mind. Each name on the list is a little flame. Some burn near history. Some flicker deep in legend. Some stand at the edge of both. A strange attention peak is waiting in the floodline. The list divides time into before and after the flood. Kingship exists before the great catastrophe. Then the flood sweeps over. Then kingship descends again. This pattern matters because it suggests that political order was imagined as older than the disaster, older than remembered dynasties, and possibly older than the stable world known to the scribes. That is not proof of a lost civilization. It is proof that Mesopotamian memory was comfortable thinking in depths beyond ordinary record. The old scribes did not begin civilization with themselves. They imagined an earlier order, distant and partly unreachable, where kings ruled in spans too large for normal life. Whether those numbers were symbolic, theological, mathematical, or literary remains debated. Some scholars see them as expressions of cosmic antiquity. Others connect them to numerical systems, sacred exaggeration, or the prestige of ancient cities. A more speculative reader, of course, hears another whisper. If kingship came from heaven and existed before the flood, could the list preserve a blurred memory of a world before the world the scribes knew? Could the impossible kings be echoes of beings not understood as ordinary humans? Could the huge reigns reflect not history as we measure it, but a mythic attempt to describe a different order of life? This should be handled gently. The evidence remains fragmentary, and ancient numbers do not behave like modern dates. The king list is not a hidden calendar waiting to be decoded into clean chronology. It is a literary and political artifact. It organizes power, memory, and divine legitimacy. But the mystery survives because the list does not merely say, "There were old kings." It says kingship itself came down from above. That phrase has weight. Kingship is not presented as a clever human invention. It descends, it arrives, it is bestowed. In the older Mesopotamian imagination, authority is something humans receive from a higher order, but once received, it becomes human machinery. Courts, armies, storehouses, inscriptions, taxes, roads, walls, and temple rituals all gather around it. The gift becomes an institution. And institutions, once human hands begin operating them, can change. This is where the theme of control returns softly. If kingship descends from heaven, then kings rule as part of divine order. Yet the king list itself is written by humans. Its sequence serves human political memory. It can elevate one city, frame another as temporary, and turn history into a chain of authorized rule. The divine origin strengthens the human institution, while the human record shapes the divine story. Clay holds both. You stand now in Eridu, not as a confirmed eyewitness, but as a listener entering a remembered city. Eridu was one of the oldest sacred centers in southern Mesopotamia, associated especially with Enki. Archaeology has revealed long sequences of temple building there, with shrines rebuilt over earlier sacred layers. Mud brick rises over mud brick. Foundations remember older foundations. A holy place becomes taller by standing on its own past. That layering feels like the king list in architectural form. Each age builds upon something half buried. Each new wall claims continuity with what lies below. Each ruler wants the weight of old names beneath his feet. If a king can connect himself to the first cities, he is no longer merely political. He becomes part of a cosmic sequence. Yet there is uncertainty in the mud. How much did later scribes know about the earliest periods they described? Were they preserving genuine memories passed through tradition, or constructing sacred antiquity for ideological purposes? Did the pre-flood kings reflect old oral tales, city rivalries, mathematical symbolism, or theological imagination? The honest answer is not singular. The list is a machine with missing parts. Some fringe interpretations treat the pre-flood reigns as evidence that the oldest rulers were not human in the ordinary sense. They connect the enormous lifespans to the Anunnaki, to hybrid beings, or to imagined advanced teachers before recorded history. These readings have an undeniable narrative pull. They make the list feel like a damaged file from a forgotten administration. But a calmer reading can be just as haunting. Perhaps ancient people used impossible time to express sacred distance. The earliest kings were not meant to be ordinary men. They belonged to a past so remote that counting itself became ceremonial. Their long reigns told listeners that the beginning was not close, not reachable, not fully human anymore. The result is the same feeling, approached responsibly. You sense a hidden timeline under the familiar one. Written history begins late compared with human existence. Cities appear after long developments in farming, settlement, trade, and ritual life. Before the first texts, people had already told stories for thousands of years. They had buried their dead, watched the sky, shaped stone, built shrines, moved with rivers, and remembered things no tablet ever caught. When writing finally arrived, it didn't capture the beginning. It captured a world already old. That may be the most important quiet reveal. The earliest writing does not open at page 1 of humanity. It begins in the middle of a long human night, when cities already have gods, workers, officials, storerooms, songs, and fears. The tablets are ancient to us, but to their scribes, many traditions were already inherited. So when the king list speaks of pre-flood kings, it may be reaching toward memory older than writing itself. Not a clean historical report, not a map. More like an echo carried through political theology, mythic number and civic pride, but echoes matter. They tell us what a culture believed had to exist before the world made sense. As dusk falls over the imagined city, the temple platform catches the last red light. A scribe looks down at a line of names and numbers. Perhaps he believes them. Perhaps he reveres them. Perhaps he copies them because kingship must have a beginning worthy of heaven. The reed stylus presses again. A name enters Clay. A reign too long for human breath follows it. And somewhere behind the numbers, the old question waits without moving. If humans were made to serve, how did they become kings? If kingship came down from heaven, when did people begin using it for themselves? If divine order ruled the first cities, Why does its memory survive as broken lists, impossible years, and a floodline dividing time like a sealed door? The tablet does not open the door. It only shows where the door once stood. A city in Mesopotamia was never only a city. It was a name, a god, a field system, a memory, a wall against uncertainty. It was a cluster of mud brick houses, temples, workshops, canals, gates, ovens, storehouses, and crowded lives. But to the people who lived inside it, a city also had a destiny. It belonged to a power greater than itself, and that power was carried in rituals, offerings, stories, and names. You follow the names as they rise from the clay. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Kish, Lagesh, Shurupak, Ul. Each one feels like a bead on an old thread. Some were associated with particular gods. Eridu was linked strongly with Enki, Lord of Wisdom, and the deep freshwater abyss. Uruk became famous for Inanna, for monumental building, and for stories surrounding Gilgamesh. Nippur held special religious prestige as the city of Enlil, whose authority touched kingship and cosmic order. The cities were earthly, yet they stood under watchful names. This is a grounded historical truth with a mysterious edge. Early Mesopotamian cities developed from real social and environmental pressures. Farming communities needed water control, storage, labor coordination, and protection. Over generations, settlements grew into urban centers with specialized workers, rulers, priestly institutions, and scribal systems. The sacred center and the economic center often overlapped. A temple could smell like incense and accounting at once. Inside its rooms, grain could be counted, animals recorded, textiles managed, and offerings prepared. The god's house was also a working institution. People brought goods, workers received rations, scribes pressed numbers into clay. Authority moved through seal impressions, measured barley, and the right to speak in the name of a deity. The sacred had ledgers. That small fact changes the way you feel the old stories. When myths say gods assigned cities or gave rulership, they are not floating above society. They are rooted in a world where power needed record keeping. If a god owned a field, someone human still measured it. If a temple received sheep, someone human still counted them. If divine order governed a city, human hands still repaired the canal. You stand in thought beside a mud brick wall at sunrise. The bricks are rough beneath your palm. The air is cool for only a short while. Soon the white heat will rise from the plain. A worker passes with a basket of reeds. A woman carries water. A priest crosses a courtyard with measured steps. The city wakes as if obeying a rhythm older than any one person. But the rhythm is not effortless. Cities require maintenance. Canals must be cleared. Storehouses must be guarded. Disputes must be judged. Temples must be supplied. Walls must be patched after storms. The divine name may hover above the city, but everything below it needs constant human effort. Here, the idea of divine control becomes strangely dependent. The gods may authorize the city, but people keep it alive. A temple statue must be dressed. A sacred meal must be prepared. A festival must be performed correctly. A song must be remembered. If humans fail, the god's earthly house falls quiet. The relationship is not simple domination from above. It is mutual maintenance, though not equal. That is a quiet attention peak. The city depends on the god, yet the god's presence depends on the city's human routines. This is not a modern idea imposed from outside. Mesopotamian religion treated temples as homes of divine presence. The cult statue was not merely decoration. It could be understood as a sacred focus, where the deity's presence was invited, honored and cared for through ritual. The exact theology is complex, and scholars debate how ordinary people understood these sacred images. Still, the practical rhythm is clear. The god must be served daily. Food, clothing, music, incense, purity, and ceremony sustain the divine household. To modern ears, this may sound strange. To an ancient city, it was the shape of order. If the god was honoured, the city stood within a meaningful cosmos. If the rituals failed, uncertainty grew teeth. Some speculative readers see this as another trace of an older system. They wonder whether divine names attached to cities could preserve memories of separate ruling powers, regional overseers, or beings assigned to particular zones. In that reading, Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur become almost like stations in a vast administration. Each has a function, each has a guardian, each holds a piece of the system. A cautious reading remains closer to the earth. Cities used patron gods to express identity, legitimacy, and political power. Rival temples and royal houses shape the stories. When one city rose, its god's reputation could expand. When another city declined, its sacred memory might be absorbed or reinterpreted. Religion and politics breathed through the same doorway. Yet the mystery does not disappear. Why does the old world so often imagine civilization as something assigned to places? Why do sacred powers seem distributed across cities, almost like a map of divine responsibilities? Why does authority appear less as a single thunderbolt and more as a network? The answer may lie in the canals. Water in southern Mesopotamia did not obey one town's desire. A canal upstream could affect fields downstream. Labour in one district could protect harvests in another. Trade routes linked cities through goods, marriages, rivalries, and treaties. The land taught people that survival was interconnected. Perhaps heaven was imagined that way because earth demanded it. Still, networks can slip from control. A system with many cities, many temples, many rulers, and many local ambitions is difficult to hold in one hand. Even divine kingship, said to descend from heaven, had to move. The king list remembers rulership passing between cities. Power does not stay fixed. It travels, settles, breaks, and reforms. You can feel that movement in the dust. A city rises bright with offerings. Another loses its walls. One god's temple expands. Another's shrine becomes a memory beneath later brick. A ruler claims universal authority. Then his dynasty fades into a line copied by students. The system continues, but never perfectly. This is where the idea of lost control becomes less dramatic and more believable as a metaphor. Control does not always collapse in one moment. Sometimes it thins. It stretches across too many places. It depends on too many human agents. It becomes ritual, then habit, then political language, then archive. The gods remain powerful in the stories, but their order must pass through human institutions. And human institutions have motives. A king may rebuild a temple to honour a god, but also to display authority. A priest may preserve a ritual to maintain cosmic balance, but also to protect the temple's status. A scribe may copy a hymn with devotion, but also because scribal training depends on tradition. Sacred order survives, but it survives through human systems that can bend it. That is not rebellion in a simple sense. It is civilization learning to carry divine language for its own purposes. Scholars continue to debate how early Mesopotamian city formation should be understood. Some emphasize environment and irrigation, some stress trade, craft specialization, temple economy, social hierarchy, or political competition. No single explanation can hold every city. The evidence is rich, uneven, and sometimes stubbornly silent. The mud keeps some secrets. By late afternoon, the imagined city glows in dusty amber light. The canal reflects a broken strip of sky. Smoke rises from ovens. A flock of birds lifts from reeds. In the temple precinct, someone checks a storage jar sealed with a cylinder seal impression. The little carved image rolls across wet clay and leaves authority behind it. A seal is a small thing, yet it says much. This belongs. This is counted. This is approved. This passes under a recognized name. In a world of temples and gods, even a lump of clay can become a border between order and confusion. The strange thought returns gently. If the gods once organized the world through cities, they chose a fragile method. Mud brick melts in rain, canals silt, kings die, scribes make errors, seals break, temples burn, names endure, but not always clearly. What survives is not control itself, but evidence that control was imagined, performed, repaired, and feared. You leave the city in evening quiet, the walls darken, the divine name remains above it like a star behind dust. Somewhere inside, a lamp is lit before a statue. Somewhere else, a scribe presses city names into clay, fixing their order for a future he cannot picture. The cities stand under watchful names, but the hands doing the watching are human now. The old word is small, but it carries the weight of a civilization. The me. You meet it first like a sign pressed too deeply into clay, familiar to the scribes, uncertain to everyone who arrives later. The me are often described as divine powers, decrees, offices, arts, or ordinances. No single English word holds them comfortably. They seem to be the patterned forces that make civilized life possible, yet they also feel like sacred permissions, pieces of order assigned from beyond ordinary human choice. This is where the story becomes quietly technical, but not cold. A city needs more than walls. It needs kingship, priesthood, wisdom, crafts, music, justice, sexual union, warfare, lamentation, scribal skill, and the strange formal beauty of social roles. In Mesopotamian thought, these were not merely human inventions scattered randomly through life. They could be imagined as powers held by gods and transferred to cities. That's a remarkable idea. Civilization becomes something like a sacred operating code. You do not need to take that phrase literally. It is only a modern image placed gently beside an ancient concept, but it helps you feel why the me have fascinated so many readers. They imply that society is not only built with hands, it is structured by invisible patterns, authorized roles, remembered procedures, and powers that must be placed correctly for the world to function. In grounded historical terms, the me belong to Sumerian religious literature. They appear especially in myths connected with Enki and Inanna. Enki, associated with wisdom, craft, and the Abzu, is often portrayed as a keeper of deep knowledge. Inanna, brilliant and dangerous, becomes the figure who acquires powers and carries them toward Uruk. The stories are literary, ritual, and theological at once, yet they also speak the language of administration. The me can be listed, they can be held, they can be given, they can be taken, they can travel from one divine center to another. This makes them feel more concrete than a vague blessing. They're almost inventory, but sacred inventory, a divine archive of what makes culture run. That is the quiet spark. Somewhere in the mythic imagination, civilization has components. You sit beside an old tablet in the soft glow of a lamp. The signs are dense, the edges are chipped. The clay smells faintly of dust when warmed by the hand, though no museum would let you hold it so carelessly. A scholar bends over a transliteration. A broken line interrupts the sense. A word may mean office, right, or divine power depending on context. The uncertainty is not a flaw, it is part of the atmosphere. Scholars still discuss how best to understand the me. Are they cosmic decrees, cultural institutions, ritual powers, divine attributes, social norms given mythic form? The answer may not be one thing. Ancient categories do not always match modern shelves. A single concept can be legal, sacred, political, artistic, and poetic at the same time. The me sit exactly in that overlapping space. They are not only ideas, they are not quite objects. They behave in stories as if they can be possessed. That has led some speculative readers to wonder whether they encode memories of technologies, rule systems, or structured knowledge transferred from non-human teachers to early cities. In popular Anunnaki theories, the me are sometimes imagined as tablets, devices, or program-like packages of civilization. Careful reading steps softly. The Sumerian texts do not give us a manual for machines. They give us mythic language for order. But mythic language can still preserve real social truths. The people of Mesopotamia understood that a city needed formal knowledge to survive. You cannot build lasting civilization from strength alone. You need measurements, calendars, rituals, skilled crafts, law, song, mourning, and shared expectations. Without those, a wall is only mud. The me suggest that the ancients saw civilization as a set of inherited powers larger than any single person. That itself is profound. A farmer may sow barley, but the agricultural order includes seasons, irrigation, field boundaries, tax obligations, storage, temple claims, and old prayers of fertility. A singer may perform a hymn, but the song belongs to tradition, training, and divine memory. You're inside a world where nothing important is merely private. Even grief has form. Even joy has rights. Even authority wears inherited language. A king is not simply strong. He must be recognized through symbols, offices, and sacred favor. A priest does not simply believe. He performs correctly. A scribe does not simply remember. He writes according to systems learned from older hands. The me are the shape beneath the surface. Here the idea of lost control turns especially subtle. If the gods hold the powers of civilization, and those powers can be transferred, then control depends on custody. Who possesses the me? Who receives them? Who carries them into a new city? Who understands how to use them? The myths themselves seem interested in this problem. Powers can move. That movement is not merely decoration. In a world of competing cities, the transfer of sacred authority mattered. If Uruk possesses certain powers, Uruk becomes more than an urban settlement. It becomes a center where divine civilization has been concentrated. If Enki guards the powers at Eridu, then wisdom is located. If Inanna brings them elsewhere, then civilization spreads through divine drama. The story of order becomes a story of redistribution. This is not only religious imagination, it reflects how cities competed, borrowed, conquered, and inherited. One center's prestige could be claimed by another. Gods traveled through myths, marriages, political domination, and cultural exchange. The sacred map was never still. A little fragment of mystery glows here. If civilization's powers were thought to move, then early Mesopotamian myth was already asking how control could leave one hand and enter another. The gods may possess the powers, but the stories are fascinated by transfer. Order is not locked away forever. It is negotiable, movable, vulnerable. You can hear the distant sound of a reed stylus. Tap, press, lift, tap, press, lift. A list forms in clay. The list itself becomes an act of control. To name the powers is to arrange them. To arrange them is to make them teachable. To make them teachable is to let humans carry them forward. This may be the most human turn of all. A sacred power becomes a school exercise. The apprentice may not fully grasp the old theology, yet he learns the signs. He copies divine names, city names, professions, stones, plants, and mythic phrases. Through this training, the powers of civilization become habits in human fingers. The divine pattern passes into curriculum. That is not dramatic. It is almost sleepy, but it may be where the deepest change happens. The gods do not lose control because a hero shouts at the sky. They lose control in a symbolic sense, when the architecture of order becomes reproducible by human memory. A ritual can be taught, a title can be copied, a law can be cited, a hymn can be sung by someone who never saw the temple where it was first composed. The me become portable through culture, of course. The ancient people would not have phrased it this way. They would have understood these powers within reverence, ritual, and divine dependence. A responsible reading must not flatten their world into modern theory. The me were sacred. They belonged to a religious imagination filled with gods, offerings, temple service, and cosmic order. But sacred things can travel through human hands. Night settles over the archive, the lamp flame shrinks, the tablet cools where it lies. A sign that once belonged to a god now rests in a human collection. A power that once descended from divine order now survives because someone wrote it correctly. The me do not answer the mystery, they deepen it. If humans were made to work, why were they also allowed to learn the structures of civilization? If the gods governed order, why did they place pieces of that order where cities could compete for them? If divine powers could be transferred, who truly held control once the transfer began? The clay keeps the question gently sealed. The transfer of sacred power becomes most vivid when Inanna enters the story. She doesn't move through Mesopotamian myth like a quiet ornament. She burns through it. She is love, conflict, desire, royal force, terrifying beauty, and the dangerous brilliance of a city that refuses to stay small. Her presence makes the old order shimmer, because she often stands where boundaries become unstable. In one of the most memorable Sumerian myths, Inanna goes to Eridu, the ancient city of Enki. There, in the House of Deep Wisdom, she receives the me. The story is playful, ceremonial, and unsettling at the same time. Enki feasts with her. Drink is shared. Words are spoken. Powers are given. Then Inanna carries them away toward Uruk. The sacred inventory begins to move. This is not a small journey. Eridu was associated with profound antiquity, watery wisdom, and Enki's hidden knowledge. Uruk, by contrast, became one of the great urban centers of early Mesopotamia, tied to Inanna and later remembered through heroic traditions around Gilgamesh. When the me travel from Eridu to Uruk, the myth seems to imagine civilization's powers shifting from one sacred center to another. That is the grounded historical layer. Cities competed not only for land and influence, but for prestige. A myth could explain why one city possessed special authority, artistry, ritual power, or cultural brilliance. To say that Inanna brought the me to Uruk was to say that Uruk's greatness had divine roots. Its institutions were not accidental. Its splendor had been carried there through sacred drama. Yet the story does not feel like a calm administrative transfer. It feels more like a divine complication. Enki later realizes what has happened and tries to recover the powers. Messengers are sent. Inanna continues toward Uruk with the me secured. The details vary in interpretation, and the tone has been read in different ways. Some see humor, some see ritual politics. Some see the celebration of Uruk's rise. Some see a goddess outmaneuvering an older male authority. The clay smiles without explaining itself. You can picture the journey in the soft light of imagination. A boat moves along dark water. Reeds whisper along the banks. The air smells of river mud, date palm fibre, and cooling earth. On board are not gold bars or weapons, but powers with names. Kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, music, crafts, weapons, desire, fear, judgment, lamentation, and many other structures of civilized life. They are strange cargo. A modern mind might want to classify them. Moral powers, social roles, cultural techniques, ritual offices, but the myth keeps them together. as if civilization itself is not tidy. It contains beauty and danger, justice and deceit, lovemaking and warfare, song and grief. The me are not only comfortable gifts, they include the hard parts of ordered life too. That is the attention peak. Civilization is not presented as pure blessing. It arrives with contradiction built into it. This matters for the broader question of control. If the gods created humans to work, and later allowed or lost pieces of civilization to cities, then human life was never only obedience. It became participation in a complex system of powers. Once those powers entered a city, they could be performed, repeated, taught, celebrated, and used. Inanna's myth suggests that divine order can be relocated. That does not mean it becomes secular or free from the gods. Uruk receives the powers through a goddess. The city's identity remains sacred, but the story still centers movement, acquisition, and possession. Enki has wisdom, Inanna obtains, Uruk receives. The system changes shape. A cautious reading sees city theology at work. Uruk's importance needed a sacred explanation. Enki's older prestige could be honoured while also subordinated to Inanna's triumph. The myth does not need a hidden technological meaning to be fascinating. It reflects political imagination, ritual authority, and the way sacred stories help cities understand themselves. But the fringe tidbit lingers because of the list-like nature of the me. Some modern interpreters imagine the me as encoded instructions, cultural packages, or knowledge modules passed between centres. They wonder whether the myth preserves a memory of planned civilization, where arts and institutions were not gradually invented but distributed. The evidence does not support that as a historical conclusion. Still, as a symbolic reading, it captures something the myth already says gently. Society runs on transferable patterns. The ancient world understood that knowledge could move. A potter's technique could travel. A sealed design could travel. A hymn could travel. A divine name could travel. A writing system could spread beyond its birthplace. Trade routes carried lapis, timber, metals, wool, grain, and stories. Even gods moved, carried by migrants, merchants, conquest, marriage alliances, and scribal tradition. So perhaps the myth of Inanna and the me is not strange because it is impossible. It is strange because it makes visible what civilization always does. It takes patterns from one place and gives them new life elsewhere. The gods may authorize the movement, but humans make it durable. You sit in a scribal school at Uruk, in the hush between heat and evening. A teacher names a sign, a student repeats it. Clay tablets dry on a shelf. Outside, the city hums with trade, worship, weaving, brewing, accounting, bargaining, and the countless small acts that make urban life survive. None of these acts feels divine when performed badly before breakfast. Yet together they form the powers of civilization. There is gentle sarcasm in that, if one listens softly, a sacred ordinance still requires someone to count the sheep. The old myths never let divine grandeur float too far from practical life. Inanna may carry the me, but Uruk must live them. Kingship must be embodied by rulers. Craft must be practiced by workers. Lamentation must be sung by voices. Judgment must be applied to quarrels. Desire must enter households. Warfare must scar borders. Music must be learned by hands and breath. A power becomes real when humans perform it. This creates an open question that scholars approach from many sides. Are myths like Inanna and Enki primarily reflections of city rivalry? Are they ritual texts explaining local cult prestige? Are they literary explorations of gender, authority, and transformation? Are they memories of cultural diffusion expressed through divine personalities? The safest answer allows several meanings at once. Ancient myths often carried more than one load. They could entertain, instruct, legitimize, preserve and unsettle. The story of a goddess taking powers from a wise god might teach something about Uruk, something about Inanna, something about civilization, and something about the instability of possession. Because to possess a power is not the same as controlling its future. Once Inanna brings the me to Uruk, the city becomes a theatre of sacred civilization. Yet every power she brings contains risk. Kingship can protect, but also dominate. Speech can bless, but also deceive. Desire can bind, but also destroy households. Music can soothe, but lamentation remembers ruin. Weapons defend and devastate. Crafts build and tempt pride. The me are not obedient tools. They are forces that enter human life and multiply through it. This is why the myth feels important to the question of divine control. It does not show humans breaking into heaven. It shows a divine figure moving cosmic powers into an urban world where humans will enact them. The shift is sacred, but it is also dangerous. The more civilization gains, the harder it becomes to keep still. Uruk rises in the mind beneath a darkening sky. Its walls glow faintly with the last red dust of sunset. Inanna's temple stands within the city's living pulse. Somewhere, offerings are prepared. Somewhere, a scribe copies a myth about powers that once travelled from Eridu. The copy is itself another transfer. Clay to clay, voice to hand, god to city, city to memory. You feel how control changes form. Enki's deep wisdom does not vanish, but it is no longer sealed in one place. Inanna's boldness does not destroy order, but it redistributes it. Uruk does not merely receive a blessing, it receives complexity, and complexity never remains perfectly obedient. The boat slips through the reeds in the old story. The powers are on board, and the river, as always, carries what no one can fully call back. By the time the city learns to live with sacred powers, humanity is no longer a small answer to a divine problem. It has become the problem that keeps changing shape. You can feel this change most clearly in the records that are not myths at all. Clay tablets do not only preserve stories of gods and kings, they preserve rations, livestock counts, field measurements, deliveries of beer, lists of workers, temple offerings, legal agreements, loans, marriages, adoptions, disputes, and receipts so ordinary that they almost make the ancient world breathe. A sheep is counted, a jar is sealed, a worker receives barley. These details feel plain, but they carry a quiet force. They show humanity becoming organized at a scale larger than memory alone could manage. When a society begins writing down who owes what, who owns what, who worked where, and which offering belonged to which temple, life has entered a new kind of order. The spoken word is no longer enough. Trust needs marks. Power needs archives. The gods still stand above the city, but clay now stands between people. Mainstream history sees early Mesopotamian writing as deeply connected to administration. The earliest signs were tied to accounting, goods, labour, and institutional control. Over time, writing expanded into literature, law, royal inscriptions, hymns, and learned tradition. That development was not sudden magic. It grew from practical needs within complex urban life, yet the result was almost magical. A human promise could survive the person who spoke it. A temple obligation could be checked later. A king's boast could travel into the future. A hymn could be copied beyond the voice of its singer. A myth could outlive the ritual room where it was once recited. Control had found a new body, not flesh, clay. You walk through an administrative space near a temple, where the light is low and the air smells of stored grain, wool grease, reed baskets, and damp earth. A scribe sits cross-legged with a tablet in his palm. His stylus moves quickly, not grandly. He is probably tired. He may be irritated. He may have no sense that thousands of years later, someone will look at his marks and call them civilization. He only needs the count to be correct. That is part of the quiet beauty. Early writing did not begin as a poem about eternity. It began, in large part, because someone needed to know how much barley moved from one place to another. Humanity's memory became official through the ordinary pressure of work. And work, in these stories, was humanity's first divine assignment. This creates a strange loop. The gods create humans to carry labour. Labour produces institutions. Institutions require writing. Writing preserves the gods. This servant begins to maintain the memory of the master. There is the attention peak, soft but sharp. Without human scribes, many divine names would have disappeared. This does not mean ancient people thought they controlled the gods. Their reverence was real. Their rituals were serious. Their fear of divine anger was woven into daily existence. But from a long historical distance, you can see a delicate reversal. The gods authorize human order in myth, while humans preserve divine order in writing. Each depends on the other inside the record. The unusual fringe tidbit grows from that reversal. Some modern interpreters imagine the temple archive as something more than administration. They picture it as a remnant of a controlled knowledge system, where priestly classes kept fragments of instructions once associated with the Anunnaki or older divine teachers. In this view, humanity's climb into writing was not merely invention, but inheritance. A careful reading must remain grounded. There is strong archaeological reason to connect early writing with local economic, social, and administrative developments. Clay tokens, sealing practices, accounting systems, and institutional storage all belong to the long prehistory of writing. You do not need distant engineers to explain why humans invented records. The pressures of cities can do that very well. But the mythic imagination adds a second layer. If civilization's powers were granted or carried from the gods, then writing becomes more than technique. It becomes a sacred technology of remembrance. Not technology in the modern glittering sense, but technology as organized method, a way to make memory durable, a way to make absence speak. That may be why the scribal world feels so close to the divine world. Scribes copied myths, omens, lexical lists, rituals, and royal inscriptions. They learned old signs and preserved words no longer used in ordinary speech. They stood at the meeting point between practical administration and sacred memory. Their work could serve temple, palace, law, trade, and literature at once. A scribe was not merely a clerk. He was a keeper of forms. The scholarly uncertainty here is broad and fascinating. How much of Mesopotamian literature began as oral tradition? How did temple schools choose what to preserve? How much did scribes reshape older myths while copying them? When a story survives in later versions, are we hearing deep antiquity, later theology, classroom tradition, or all three braided together? The tablet answers by being broken. This incompleteness prevents certainty, but it also creates the mood. We do not have a single smooth voice from ancient Sumer. We have fragments, copies, lists, bilingual traditions, damaged edges, missing beginnings, and lines restored carefully by comparison. The past comes to us through human decisions and accidents. That makes the theme of control even more fragile. A divine decree may be imagined as eternal, but its survival depends on clay fired by chance in a burning building. A royal inscription may claim everlasting fame, but only if the stone is not smashed or reused. A myth may carry the breath of gods, but only if a student copies the signs correctly enough for another hand to read. Control becomes vulnerable to dust. Outside the archive, the city continues expanding. More people means more accounts, more fields mean more disputes, more temples mean more offerings, More kings mean more inscriptions. The human world is no longer a quiet workforce under divine command. It has become a network of claims, obligations, memories, and ambitions. The gods can still be invoked, but invocation itself becomes a human skill. A king invokes a god to justify conquest. A priest invokes a god to maintain ritual authority. A debtor swears by a god to secure trust. A scribe records the oath, and the clay waits silently to be used against someone later. It is all very sacred, and also very practical. Mesopotamia had little patience for separating the two. You can almost hear a tired accountant muttering beneath the gaze of heaven. That gentle human texture prevents the mystery from becoming too clean. If the gods were losing control, it was not because humans suddenly became powerful in a heroic way. It was because humans became entangled, specialized, literate, and institutionally clever. They made systems that could continue without any one person fully understanding the whole. That is how civilization grows. It becomes larger than intention. The earliest cities may have tried to place everything under divine order, yet the result was a human world full of interpretation. One temple might read a sign one way. A rival city might tell a different story. One king might claim divine favor. Another might claim the same god withdrew favor from his enemy. The divine language remained, but people used it from competing positions. Sacred order became an argument. This is not a failure of belief. It is a feature of complex society. Once a symbol becomes powerful, many hands reach for it. Once writing can preserve authority, it can also challenge, reinterpret, or outlast authority. The record meant to stabilize the world becomes the place where instability is revealed. You sit again with the scribe in the dim room. He presses a final line into clay. The tablet is set aside to dry. Around him are shelves, baskets, ceilings, and other small objects of control. None looks dramatic. No thunder sounds. No god steps visibly through the door. Still, something enormous has happened. A human hand has made memory harder to kill. The city breathes beyond the walls, restless with markets, animals, prayers, births, complaints, and calculations. It is still under divine names. It is still surrounded by uncertainty. It still fears flood, famine, plague, invasion, and abandonment. Yet it now possesses a tool that lets it speak across absence. Humanity was once imagined as noise disturbing the gods. Now the noise has learned to write itself down, and once a creation writes itself into the world, control becomes much harder to keep, because even silence may later be read. The flood enters the Mesopotamian imagination like a silence too large for one city. It is not only water, it is interruption. It is the moment when the long human noise, the labour, the counting, the building, the offerings, the marriages, the arguments, and the songs are answered by something that does not negotiate. In the old stories, the flood is not weather alone, it is decision. You approach it carefully. Mesopotamia was a land where floods were real. Rivers brought life, but they also brought fear. The Tigris and Euphrates could rise unpredictably, change channels, drown fields, and leave behind mud where a household had once stood. Archaeology has found flood deposits at some ancient sites, though not one universal layer covering all of Mesopotamia at once. The historical reality was complex, local, and uneven, but myth gathers scattered fear into a single image. Water over everything. In the Atrahasis tradition, the gods have already tried lesser measures to reduce humanity. The noise of human multiplication has become intolerable. Disease, drought, and famine appear as attempts to quiet the world. Each measure fails to solve the problem completely, partly because wisdom intervenes and humans learn how to survive. Then the decision darkens. The flood becomes a final reset. That word is modern, but it fits the shape of the myth gently. A reset is what happens when a system becomes too unstable to repair through ordinary correction. The old order is overwhelmed. The designers do not merely adjust it, they wipe it down to a beginning, or as close to a beginning as they can make it. This is a chilling idea, but the story keeps it ancient and solemn. The gods are not presented as simple villains. Their world is strained. Their rest is broken. Their decision emerges from conflict, hierarchy, and fear. Enlil is often associated with the severe impulse to destroy humanity, while Enki becomes a subtle figure who preserves life through warning. The divine council itself is divided. That division matters. If the gods were fully in control, they would act as one. Instead, the flood stories show disagreement inside heaven. One divine will seeks erasure. Another bends the rule to preserve a chosen human. The system does not merely control humanity. It argues with itself over what humanity has become. There is the quiet attention peak. The flood is not only a punishment, it is evidence of divine conflict. You sit now in the imagined hush before rain. The sky has turned a strange colour over the plain. The reeds along the canal flatten in restless wind. Animals sense what people cannot yet name. Inside a house of mud brick and wood, a man listens to a warning that comes in a veiled way, not spoken openly to him in the simplest form. The famous flood survivor appears under different names in different traditions. In Sumerian material, Ziusudra receives preservation. In the Akkadian Atrahasis story, Atrahasis is warned. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he survived the Great Flood and was granted a strange form of life beyond ordinary human fate. These stories are related but not identical. Their differences matter because they show living tradition. Myths were not museum objects in the ancient world. They moved, adapted, and took new forms in different languages, cities, and periods. A flood memory could become a wisdom tale, a creation crisis, a royal meditation, or a lesson about mortality. The water remained, but its meaning shifted. Mainstream scholarship often understands these flood stories through Near Eastern myth, environmental memory, theological reflection, and literary development. They may reflect real experiences of catastrophic local flooding, transformed over time into cosmic narrative. They also express the fragility of human civilization in riverlands where water could both bless and destroy. The speculative edge comes from the structure. Some modern readers wonder whether the flood represents not only natural disaster, but deliberate intervention in a human project. They point to the staged attempts to reduce humanity, the council decision, and the secret warning given against that decision. In fringe interpretations, the flood becomes a failed deletion of a creation that had grown beyond control. This reading is not established history, but the myth itself does imagine planned destruction and partial preservation. That is enough to make the question linger. Humanity is not wiped out by accident in the story. Humanity is targeted because its existence has become intolerable, then saved because one divine figure refuses total erasure. The result is not simple judgment. It is a broken command. You can feel the tension in the warning scene. Enki must not openly violate the council's decision, so he speaks indirectly, depending on the version and interpretation. The warning may pass through a wall, a dreamlike message, or a clever form of communication. The survivor understands enough to build a vessel. He preserves life, animals, seed, kin, and continuity. A message slips through the rules. That is one of the strangest details. The preservation of humanity depends on a loophole. A divine intelligence works around divine authority. The gods decide, but not all gods obey in the same way. Control fractures at the very moment it tries to become absolute. The reign begins in the mind. It starts softly and then fills everything. Roofs darken, streets dissolve, riverbanks vanish. The canal loses its shape. the distinction between field, road, courtyard, and shrine melts into moving brown water. People in these stories are not described in modern graphic detail, and you do not need such detail. The enormity is enough. A world of names becomes a world without edges. The flood is memory losing its shelves. If tablets survive, they do so by burial, burning, luck, or later copying. If stories survive, they do so through mouths and schools and scribal discipline. A flood in myth threatens more than bodies. It threatens continuity. It asks whether the work of civilization can be washed back into silence. And yet, the story survives because silence failed. The survivor carries memory forward. This is where the theme turns gently. The flood may be imagined as divine reset, but it does not restore perfect control. It creates survivors. Survivors remember, they tell, they warn. They become proof that the decision was not complete. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim's flood account is spoken to a king who seeks escape from death. That context changes the emotional weight. The story is not only about human noise or divine punishment, it becomes part of a meditation on mortality. Gilgamesh must learn that even the greatest king cannot simply seize everlasting life. The flood then becomes a boundary. Before and after, mortal and immortal, and human desire and divine limit, city fame and final silence. Scholars continue to debate the relationships among the Sumerian flood story, Atrahasis, the Gilgamesh tradition, and other ancient Near Eastern flood narratives. Which elements are oldest? How did oral memory influence written versions? How much is environmental recollection? And how much is theological structure? The evidence is rich, but incomplete. The clay is wet at the edges of certainty. You watch the waters recede in imagination, but not too quickly. Mud clings to everything. The air smells of silt, dead reeds, broken timber, and exhausted rain. Birds circle in pale light. The world is not new in a bright way. It is emptied, damaged, and uncertain. A survivor steps into it carrying memory like a fragile ember. That ember changes everything. A complete reset would leave no witness. A successful erasure would leave no story. But Mesopotamian flood tradition gives you the opposite. It gives you a witness who knows the gods tried to end the human noise. It gives you a divine warning that escaped the council. It gives you a world where humans continue with the knowledge that their existence was once judged too much. This does not prove hidden history. It reveals ancient anxiety with unusual clarity. Humanity is necessary, yet disturbing, fragile, yet persistent. Created for work, yet impossible to reduce to work. Loud enough to trouble heaven, clever enough to survive, and memorable enough to press its near ending into clay. The flood becomes a reset that didn't fully reset. Night falls over the waterlogged plain. A broken branch drifts past a temple mound. Somewhere beyond the visible world, the divine council has not become peaceful. Somewhere on earth, a human hand begins again with mud, wood, seed, fire, and memory. The gods tried to quiet the world, but the world kept one listener. The survivor is the most dangerous person in the story, not because he carries a weapon, not because he defeats a god, not because he stands above other humans in strength. He's dangerous because he remembers what was meant to be forgotten, and because his survival proves that the command against humanity was never complete. In Mesopotamian flood traditions, the preserved man appears through different names and shapes. Ziusudra in the Sumerian account, Atrahasis in the Akkadian tradition, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. These figures are not exactly interchangeable, yet they belong to the same deep family of stories. Each stands near the waterline between destruction and continuity. You meet him in the quiet after the storm. The world around him has not recovered. Mud lies thick over the old paths. The reeds are bent flat. Wooden beams float where walls once stood. The sky feels emptied of its former pattern. Nothing here resembles a triumphant new beginning. It is quieter than victory. It is the exhausted silence that follows a decision too large for human speech. And in that silence, one man knows. He knows the flood was not only water. He knows there was a divine decision behind it. He knows that a warning came through hidden channels. He knows that the living world continued because the plan to end it was interrupted from within, the divine order itself. That knowledge is a burden. Mainstream scholarship treats these figures as literary and theological constructions, shaped through many generations of Mesopotamian storytelling. The flood survivor explains why humanity continues after divine anger. He preserves the memory of catastrophe. In the Gilgamesh tradition, he also becomes a mirror for human mortality, because Gilgamesh seeks from him the secret of escaping death. But the figure carries more than one meaning. He's a survivor, a witness, a priestly memory, a boundary marker, and perhaps a warning. In some versions, he offers sacrifice after the flood, and the gods gather around the offering. The detail is strange and deeply human. After trying to reduce or destroy humanity, the divine world responds to the smell of sacrifice. The relationship resumes, but it does not return unchanged. The offering rises like smoke from a broken world. That is the quiet attention peak. The gods try to end human noise, yet after the flood they gather around a human ritual. The image is not simple. It has been interpreted in different ways. Some see it as restoring the bond between humans and gods. Some see it as showing the dependence of gods on offerings within the mythic imagination. Some read it as an ancient explanation for why sacrificial worship matters. The clay does not flatten the moment into one lesson. It leaves you with discomfort. If humans were created to serve the gods, and the gods attempted to remove them, the post-flood sacrifice suggests the divine order still requires human participation. This does not mean the gods are weak in the way humans are weak. It means the mythic system imagines relationship, exchange, and dependence woven together. A world without humans may not be the world the gods can comfortably inhabit. That possibility unsettles the idea of control. You stand beside the survivor as smoke moves into a pale sky. The scent is heavy, a mixture of damp earth, burnt offering, and clean air after days of rain. The altar is rough, the hands are tired. The animals preserved through terror now become part of ritual order. Life continues through gratitude, fear, obligation, and memory. Nothing is pure relief. The survivor has escaped, but he has not escaped meaning. He becomes part of the divine settlement. In the Gilgamesh version, Utnapishtim and his wife are granted a remote, extraordinary existence. They are placed far away, at the mouth of the rivers, beyond ordinary human society. That distance matters. The survivor is not simply returned to city life as if nothing happened. He becomes a living exception. An exception is powerful because it reveals the rule. Ordinary humans remain mortal. Ordinary cities remain vulnerable. Ordinary kings cannot seize everlasting life. Gilgamesh travels to Utnapishtim, hoping to learn how not to die. But the story does not give him that victory. Instead, it gives him a tale of a unique event, a divine decision that cannot be repeated by human will. This is one reason scholars read the flood account within Gilgamesh as a lesson about limits. The greatest hero must return to Uruk without immortality. He must look at the city walls, the work of human hands, and accept that endurance comes through building, naming, ruling, and being remembered, not through escaping death completely. Still, the older flood memory remains inside that lesson. A forbidden mercy has already happened once. Enki's role is especially important in this mystery. As a god of wisdom, craft, and hidden waters, he often works through intelligence rather than open force. In the flood traditions, his warning allows the survivor to preserve life. Depending on how the story is told, he does not necessarily defy the divine counsel in a blunt way. He speaks indirectly, carefully, perhaps to a wall or through a dreamlike form. The warning is almost bureaucratic in its cleverness. A rule is kept on the surface, a message passes underneath. This is where speculative readers lean close to the tablet. They see in Enki not merely a compassionate deity, but a figure preserving a project against the wishes of harsher powers. In fringe interpretations, the survivor becomes a chosen carrier of a biological, cultural, or civilizational program that one faction wished to erase and another wished to continue. A careful reading does not need to accept that literally, but it can acknowledge the pattern. The divine world is divided. Humanity survives because one divine actor values continuity over total judgment. The flood is not a clean expression of unified control. It is a failed closure, interrupted by hidden communication. That is why the survivor cannot be a simple hero. He is evidence of a crack in heaven. Scholarly uncertainty remains around how early these motifs are, how they moved between Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, and how later scribes shaped them for new purposes. The Sumerian flood story is fragmentary. Etrahasis offers a fuller creation and flood framework. Gilgamesh gives the flood a new philosophical setting. Each version holds a different lamp over the same dark water. You cannot force them into one perfect map. You can only follow the reflections. One reflection shows disaster as punishment. Another shows overpopulation as disturbance. Another shows wisdom preserving life. Another shows mortality as the final boundary. Together they form a pattern that feels less like a single doctrine and more like an ancient conversation. The survivor listens from its center. He has heard something humans were not meant to hear. He has obeyed a hidden instruction. He has preserved animals and kin, seed, memory, and the possibility of future offerings. When he steps out into the wet world, he is not beginning civilization from nothing. He is carrying old civilization through rupture. This is important. The flood does not create humanity. It interrupts humanity. That means whatever follows is already haunted by what came earlier. The post-flood world is not innocent. It is inherited. It begins with a witness who knows that divine order can turn against its own creation, and that divine mercy can quietly break rank. The clay remembers this in fragments. You see the survivor later as Gilgamesh might see him, remote and almost impossible to reach, not a king in a palace, not a priest in a crowded city, a figure at the edge of human maps, beyond ordinary dust, holding a story that no ambitious ruler can turn into personal escape. He has what Gilgamesh wants, but cannot give it like a tool. Immortality is not a craft lesson. That may be the gentle tragedy of the tale. Humans inherit memory, but not all power. They can write the flood, sing the gods, preserve kings, rebuild cities, and copy lines across centuries, yet they remain mortal, noisy, and unfinished. The survivor shows that humanity escaped erasure, but did not become divine. Control was broken, not reversed. The gods did not lose everything. Humans did not gain everything. The old relationship continued in a damaged balance, offerings rising, commands descending, kings seeking favor, scribes preserving stories, and the fear of another catastrophe resting quietly behind ritual life. The survivor's true gift may be that he makes forgetting impossible. As evening lowers over the wet plain, the smoke thins, the water withdraws into channels. Mud begins to crack under returning heat. The first sounds return carefully. Insects in reeds, birds over pools, footsteps in soft earth, a voice calling from a distance. The world is not silent anymore. It begins again with a witness, and somewhere in that witness, the creation that was supposed to be quiet learns the most powerful form of noise, the story that survives the order to end it. The world after the waters is not clean. That's the first thing you feel. The flood may have washed the land, but it did not wash away memory. It left silt in the low places, broken reeds along the banks, and a thin silence over every place where human voices had once gathered too closely. The plain does not glow like a new paradise. It lies heavy, damp, and uncertain, as if creation itself is catching its breath. A reset is never as simple as it sounds. If the old Mesopotamian stories imagined the flood as a divine attempt to reduce humanity, the world that follows becomes deeply important. It is not a return to emptiness. It is not a perfect beginning. It is a damaged continuation. The survivor has carried life through the catastrophe, and with life comes everything the gods had found troubling: labor, hunger, speech, memory, desire, and the need to build again. You can sense the first human tasks returning. A fire must be made, a shelter must be repaired, seed must be saved, animals must be watched, mud must be scraped from tools, water must be found that is safe enough to drink. The body begins with practical things. The mind follows more slowly, circling the question of why any of this was allowed to happen. Ancient Mesopotamia knew this pattern well. Cities were repeatedly damaged by flood, war, neglect, and political change. Temples were rebuilt over older temples. Walls were restored after collapse. Canals were cleared after silt filled them. Ruin and reconstruction were not rare exceptions. They were part of the rhythm of settled life. The past was always underfoot. This gives the post-flood myths a grounded texture. A community that had seen disaster could imagine rebuilding not as a heroic moment, but as a long obligation. The world continues because people perform necessary work even when the meaning of that work feels wounded. That is a very old kind of courage. Still, the mythic layer adds something stranger. If the flood was meant to quiet humanity, rebuilding becomes an act of persistence. Every new fire, wall, field, and offering says that the human presence has not been removed. The gods may have reduced the noise, but they did not end the source of it. The system resumes, yet it resumes with a hidden flaw. Someone remembers that the system once tried to close. That memory changes the atmosphere. You walk in imagination over drying mud near a settlement mound. The earth pulls at your sandals. Broken pottery catches the light. A length of reed matting lies twisted around a branch. In the distance, river birds stand in shallow pools. The sky's pale and wide, everything feels exposed. A human world is being assembled from remains. Mainstream historians do not read these myths as simple reports of one worldwide event. They examine local flood deposits, settlement patterns, textual traditions, and literary forms. Mesopotamia's flood stories likely gathered real environmental fears and historical memories into a cosmic narrative. The river landscape made such stories feel believable, because water could truly erase boundaries overnight. But myths do more than remember weather. They organize fear into meaning. In the post-flood world, meaning has to be renegotiated. If humans were created to serve the gods, and if they were nearly destroyed for becoming too numerous or too loud, then what kind of relationship continues afterward? Is humanity forgiven, tolerated, managed, or merely allowed to continue under strict terms? The tablets do not give one clean answer. Some traditions emphasize renewed sacrifice. Some preserve divine regret or disagreement. Some focus on the survivor's exceptional fate. Some shift attention toward kingship, mortality, or the return of civilization. What remains steady is the sense that human life continues under divine awareness, but not under simple safety. The old confidence has been soaked through. This is where a curious fringe reading appears softly. Some modern interpreters imagine the post-flood world as a second phase of human management. The flood, in that view, was not the end of the project, but a failed correction. Humanity survived. So the controlling powers had to adopt new methods, shorter lifespans, kingship, priesthood, ritual obligation, and tighter systems of social order. This is not established scholarship, yet a symbolic interpretation. It notices something real in the myths. The world after catastrophe is more regulated, more cautious, and more dependent on formal structures. Kingship returns, offerings continue, cities rise under divine names. Human beings do not simply scatter into freedom. They rebuild inside systems of authority. The reset becomes reconstruction, and reconstruction needs rules. The attention peak comes with a strange reversal. The flood may have been meant to reduce human disorder, yet the world after the flood requires even more organization than the world lost to it. Survival depends on planning, memory, storage, and ritual. If the gods wished for quiet, the rebuilding of civilization creates new archives, new cities, and new lines of descent. The human noise returns with better records. That is almost funny. In a very dry Mesopotamian way, you can picture a scribe generations later writing about a flood that once drowned human clamour, while seated inside a city humming with workers, animals, merchants, priests, children, and students. The very act of writing the flood story proves that humanity has not been silenced. It has become more skilled at remembering its near-silencing. The scholarly uncertainty rests in how these stories relate to early political ideas. Did the flood divide mythic time from historical time? Did it explain why kingship had to descend again? Did it help later dynasties place themselves within a sacred continuity that survived cosmic rupture? Or did it preserve older oral traditions that predated the written forms now available to us? The clay leaves room for all these questions. That room is not empty. It is filled with fragments. A broken Sumerian flood tablet may leave gaps where the heart of the story once stood. Akkadian versions may preserve fuller narrative structures while reshaping older themes. Later literary traditions may place the survivor in new roles. Each version is like a recovered wall built from bricks of different ages. You do not know which brick remembers the first house. The post-flood world itself feels like that. Old pieces are reused. New walls rise over ruined foundations. Sacred names survive in changed settings. A city claims continuity with a beginning it never saw. A king presents himself as restorer of order, even if the order he restores is partly invented by the act of restoration. Civilization does not merely survive disaster. It tells stories that make survival meaningful. This matters for the idea that the gods lost control. Loss of control does not require that divine power vanished. In the Mesopotamian world, gods remain formidable. They send omens, receive offerings, guard cities, judge kings, and appear in dreams. But the flood traditions suggest that divine control was not smooth. It could be debated, resisted indirectly, interrupted by mercy, and followed by unintended continuity. Humanity remained inside the divine world, but not as a simple object. It had become a bearer of aftermath. You hear that aftermath in the low sounds of rebuilding. Clay being kneaded, reed bundles being tied, a doorpost being raised, a child asking why the ground still smells strange after the water, an elder answering with a story softened for young ears, a priest preparing an offering with hands that understand both gratitude and fear. The first post-flood rituals must have felt heavy in the imagination. They did not happen in innocence. They rose from a world that knew it had been nearly removed. If the survivor's sacrifice drew the gods near, then every later offering could carry a faint echo of that first smoke, feed the divine order, restore the bond, keep the world from slipping again. Temple life becomes a kind of maintenance against catastrophe. This is deeply Mesopotamian. Order was not assumed to be permanent. It had to be maintained through correct action, good rulership, divine favour, and practical labour. The canal had to be cleared, the offering had to be made, the omen had to be read, the tablet had to be copied, the king had to build judge, conquer, and repair. The world did not hold itself together. That may be the softest and most unsettling insight. In these traditions, creation is not a finished object. It is an ongoing arrangement. Humans were made, but then had to be managed. Cities were founded, but then had to be rebuilt. Divine authority descended, but then had to be performed through mortal institutions. Everything needed upkeep, even the memory of the gods. As the land dries, the first cracks appear in the mud. They spread quietly, thin lines under returning sunlight. Green shoots may come later. For now, the world is brown, silver, and pale. A river moves back into its channel as if nothing has happened, though everything has. The survivors' descendants will not live in silence. They will speak, build, trade, argue, sing, and write. They will name kings and cities. They will tell children that once the waters covered all they knew. They will honour gods whose decisions they do not fully understand. And in doing so, they will rebuild the very complexity that the flood could not erase. The reset failed to become emptiness. It became memory with mud on its hands. Kingship returns like a word spoken over wet earth. That is the strange rhythm of the old lists. The flood comes, the world breaks, and then kingship descends again from heaven. Not farming, not speech, not fire. Kingship. The institution of rule is treated as something so essential that civilization cannot truly resume until authority has been placed back into the human world. You linger over that idea quietly. In Mesopotamian thought, kingship was never only politics, it carried sacred weight. A king was expected to protect temples, maintain justice, defeat enemies, repair canals, honour gods, and keep the land inside a recognizable order. He was mortal, but his office touched heaven. His body would age, but the role he carried was older than him. This is why royal inscriptions often feel both proud and anxious. A ruler boasts of building walls, restoring shrines, digging canals, feeding gods, and crushing disorder. Yet beneath the confidence is a tremor. If kings must constantly claim they restored order, then order was always under threat. If every king says he repaired what was broken, the world must have had many ways of breaking. The crown is a promise against collapse. You walk now through a city where rebuilding has become ceremonial. The mud brick walls rise again in the heat. Workers carry baskets of clay. Surveyors measure lines. Priests purify a foundation. A king's name is pressed into bricks before they are set into sacred walls. The smell of wet clay mixes with sweat, reed fibre, and the bitter smoke of offerings. Each brick says the same thing in a different form. I was here, I restored, I served the god. Archaeologists have found countless building inscriptions from Mesopotamian rulers. These texts were often placed in temples or foundations, where they could speak to gods, future kings, and perhaps future memory itself. They present the king as restorer of sacred order. He builds not merely for comfort, but for legitimacy. That is the grounded layer. The mystery appears when kingship itself is imagined as descending. If authority comes from heaven, then human rule is not invented from below. It is received from above. Yet every historical king uses that received authority in a human landscape full of rivals, alliances, ambitions, labour demands, and fragile resources. Divine kingship becomes a tool for mortal governance. The gift can be handled many ways. Here the question of control becomes sharper, though still quiet. If the gods grant kingship to regulate humanity, then kings are part of the management system. They reduce chaos. They organize labour. They command armies. They maintain temples. They help keep the human world aligned with divine expectation. But kings also expand human power. A king can build cities larger than his ancestors knew. He can gather wealth. He can conscript labour. He can shape memory through inscriptions. He can claim that the gods favour his campaign, and that his enemy's god has withdrawn protection. The office meant to uphold divine order can become a human engine of ambition. That is a small, dangerous hinge. The Sumerian king list itself shows kingship moving from city to city. Kish receives it. Then other cities rise. Uruk, Ur, Awan, Hamazi, Adab, Mari. And others appear in varying sequences depending on versions and traditions. The list is not a neutral chronicle. It arranges political memory under the idea of one legitimate kingship moving through time. Scholars debate its purposes. Was it designed to support claims of unity after periods of rivalry? Was it a school text, a political theology, a learned tradition, or all of these? How much of its earlier material preserves genuine historical memory, and how much is legendary arrangement? The later dynasties become more historically grounded, but the whole structure remains shaped by ideology. The list does not simply record power, it teaches power how to remember itself. A fringe reading sees in this descent of kingship another hint of external administration. Some modern interpreters imagine the gods assigning rulers as overseers after the flood, placing human governance under controlled lines of authority. The king becomes a local manager in a larger divine order, perhaps even a substitute once the old powers withdrew from direct rule. This remains speculative, but as a mythic pattern, it is worth noticing carefully. After a catastrophe that nearly erases humanity, the return of kingship suggests not freedom from control, but reorganized control. Humanity continues, yet within a structure authorized from above. The world is rebuilt, but not left alone. That may be why kingship feels both protective and heavy. You hear the city at midday. Hammers strike wood. Clay is packed into moulds. A scribe reads a royal inscription aloud to check its wording. Priests prepare a ritual for the foundation of a temple wall. Labourers wait for rations under a strip of shade. Their bodies make kingship visible, because no royal dream becomes brick without human backs. This is another quiet attention peak. The king claims divine favour, but the city rises through ordinary labour. Mesopotamian texts often present the good king as a builder. He restores temples, he makes canals flow, he establishes justice for widows and orphans, at least in ideal language. This royal self-presentation reveals what society valued. A ruler had to be more than a warrior. He had to appear as caretaker of divine and human order. Yet royal power could be harsh. Labour obligations, warfare, taxation, punishment, and political domination were real. The sacred language of kingship could soften these realities, but not erase them. A ruler might call himself shepherd, a gentle image, while commanding armies and workers across wide territories. Ancient politics knew how to wear beautiful clothes. Still, the shepherd image matters. It suggests that people imagined rule as guidance, protection, and controlled movement. A flock without a shepherd scatters. A land without a king risks disorder. But a shepherd also owns, directs, and uses the flock. The metaphor holds care and control together. That double meaning fits the larger story. If humans were created to work and then multiplied beyond divine comfort, kingship may be seen as a way to channel human noise into useful patterns. Cities, armies, fields, temples, and archives all require direction. Kingship makes the crowd legible. It turns many voices into one inscription. For a while, because no institution removes uncertainty. Kings die, dynasties fail, cities rebel, conquests are undone, temples are destroyed and rebuilt. A royal name meant to last forever can survive only as a cracked brick under sand. The office descends from heaven, but its carriers remain clay. That contrast is tender and severe. You imagine a foundation deposit hidden beneath a temple floor. A small object, a brick, a figurine, a text invoking divine favour for the building and the ruler. It is placed where future eyes are not meant to see it, yet where the gods might notice. The king writes into the ground itself, asking memory to become architecture. There is something almost sleepy about this hidden confidence. Build deep enough, and perhaps time will obey. But time does not obey. It covers. It breaks. It preserves by accident. It allows later excavators to uncover what was buried not for them, but for gods and future kings. Archaeology becomes an unintended listener to royal prayer. That is one of the loveliest uncertainties. Did kings imagine us the distant readers? Did they think only of God's successors and enemies? When they placed inscriptions in foundations, were they speaking to eternity, or simply to the sacred world beneath their feet? The tablet does not say, a human king may claim he works for the gods, but his words also work for himself. He wants his name to continue. He wants his restoration remembered. He wants the city to know that order passed through him. In this, kingship becomes one of humanity's great answers to mortality. You cannot live forever, but your wall might stand. Your name might remain in clay. Gilgamesh learns a version of this lesson in literary form. He cannot obtain immortality like Utnapishtim, but he can point to the walls of Uruk. The city becomes human endurance, not eternal life, but lasting work, not escape from death, but a monument others can walk beside. That is a calmer and deeper rebellion than immortality. Humanity accepts the divine limit, then builds anyway. As evening settles, the rebuilt temple wall glows softly in the fading heat. The king's brick is hidden inside it. A priest completes the ritual. Labourers drift toward food and rest. A scribe smooths unused clay with his thumb. The city is not safe forever, but it stands tonight. Kingship has descended again, yet in descending, it has entered human trouble. It must be spoken, copied, enforced, resisted, inherited, and remembered. What came from heaven now depends on clay tablets, brick moulds, temple workers, royal ambition, and the fragile loyalty of people who wake each morning with dust on their feet. The gods may have placed kingship into the world to restore order, but once kingship entered history, history began reshaping it. Between the gods and the city stood people trained to keep the passage open. They were priests, singers, lamentation specialists, diviners, temple workers, purification experts, and scribes who knew how to turn sacred order into repeated action. Their world was not always dramatic. Much of it was careful, scheduled, exacting, and quiet. A ritual performed wrongly was not merely untidy. It could disturb the fragile balance between divine presence and human need. You enter this world through sound, not the broad noise of a marketplace, but the measured sound of voices inside a temple court. A chant rises slowly, a drumbeat keeps its soft pattern. A door opens to an inner room where ordinary people may not go. Oil lamps burn with a steady glow. Incense curls into air already thick with heat, wool, dust, and the faint mineral smell of plastered brick. Here, control is not shouted, it is maintained. The temple was one of the great organizing structures of Mesopotamian life. It could hold economic power, ritual authority, cultural memory, and local identity. Its personnel cared for the divine household, managed offerings, preserved hymns, performed purification rites, and helped interpret signs from the gods. The sacred was not left to feeling alone. It had procedures. That is a grounded historical detail, but also a mysterious one. If the gods were powerful, why did they need such constant maintenance? Why did the divine presence require food offerings, clothing, music, incense, correct timing, purified spaces, and specialists trained across years? A believer in that world may not have heard the question as doubt. Service was the proper form of relationship. The gods deserved care because they were gods. Still, from a distance, the pattern feels delicate. The divine order depends on human routine. A temple statue, once ritually enlivened, could serve as the earthly focus of a god's presence. Scholars remain careful about exactly how ancient people understood this presence, because texts vary and modern categories are clumsy. The statue was not simply stone, yet it was not the totality of the god. It was a meeting point, a seat, a body prepared for divine nearness. That uncertainty is important. It leaves the temple both concrete and strange. You imagine hands washing a sacred object before dawn. Linen is folded. Food is prepared. A cup is set in place. The god's chamber is treated like a royal household. But the ruler within cannot be handled casually. Every motion carries inherited meaning. Every offering repeats an old agreement between heaven and earth. The quiet attention peak comes in the repetition itself. A god may rule the city, but a missed ritual can make the city afraid. This does not mean Mesopotamians believed the gods were helpless. It means they lived in a world where relationships required maintenance. Just as canals needed clearing and walls needed repair, divine favour required service. The same civilization that counted barley also counted sacred obligations. Order was never automatic. The priests stood inside that burden. They were not only spiritual figures in the modern sense. Many were part of complex institutions tied to land, labour, archives, music, learning, and political legitimacy. Some rituals protected kings. Some marked festivals. Some answered impurity. Some sought guidance through omens. The temple world gave form to invisible anxiety. And anxiety was everywhere. A strange birth, an eclipse, a deformed animal, a dream, a sudden illness, a pattern in oil on water, the movement of smoke, the liver of a sacrificed animal, all could become signs. Divination was not random superstition to its practitioners. It was a disciplined effort to read divine intention in a world where disaster often arrived without warning. To modern ears, that may sound distant, but the desire is familiar. Humans still want the future to speak before it arrives. Mesopotamian diviners built learned traditions around this desire. They compiled omen series, preserved observations, and trained specialists to interpret signs. The practice was deeply embedded in elite decision-making. Kings cared about omens because kingship stood under divine judgment. A bad sign could trouble a campaign, a ritual, or a throne. Here the gods didn't need to appear directly. They could communicate through patterns. That makes the system even more intricate. Divine control, if imagined this way, was distributed through signs, interpreters, rituals, and written collections. A message from the gods did not simply strike the earth like lightning. It had to be noticed, classified, read, and acted upon by humans who knew the tradition. The more you look, the more human mediation appears. This is where a fringe possibility enters softly. Some modern readers have wondered whether priestly and scribal classes preserved fragments of older technical knowledge under the language of ritual. Omen reading, sacred calendars, purification procedures, and temple routines can look, from a distance, like remnants of a control system translated into religion. That interpretation is speculative. A responsible reading stays closer to culture, theology, and institution. These rituals developed within ancient religious worlds, shaped by experience, authority, and tradition. They do not need to hide machines or secret sciences to be meaningful. Their power lies in how carefully they organized uncertainty. Even so, the language of system remains tempting. There were schedules, specialists, rules, archives, signs, corrections, and responses. The temple operated like a living interface between human vulnerability and divine command. If the gods once ruled more directly in mythic time, then priesthood may represent the later method, less visible presence, more mediated control. Or perhaps it is only how humans learn to live with absence. That may be the deeper uncertainty. Did rituals maintain an active bond with powers believed to be near? Or did they also soothe the fear that the powers had withdrawn? When a city sang laments to a god, was it communicating with presence, longing for return, or both? When offerings were made daily, did people feel certainty? Or did ritual create certainty where none could be guaranteed? The temple does not answer in one voice. It gives you song, smoke, and procedure. You walk through a corridor where mud brick walls hold the day's heat. A reed mat brushes your ankle. The air tastes faintly of ash and dates. In a room nearby, scribes copy ritual texts and lexical lists. Their training preserves old Sumerian forms even when Akkadian dominates daily speech. The past itself becomes liturgical, repeated because sacred language has power beyond ordinary conversation. That's another subtle shift of control. The gods' words require human schools. A prayer misremembered may lose force. A ritual formula must be copied. A lament must be sung in the proper tradition. The divine order passes through education, and education passes through fallible bodies. Students forget. Tablets break. Teachers disagree. Cities favour different customs. An old sign can become obscure, yet still be copied because tradition demands it. Control survives by becoming tradition. Tradition survives by tolerating imperfection. There is something beautifully human in that. The temple tries to stabilize the cosmos through repeated acts, but every repetition contains small variation. A voice is older this year. A tablet has a chipped edge. The king who sponsored the ritual is dead. The canal outside has shifted. A child who once watched from a doorway now carries offerings with adult hands. The ritual remains, yet time moves through it. In a world shaped by divine administration, priests were the keepers of continuity. They helped make sure the gods were fed, honoured, consulted, and remembered. But they also made the gods dependent on human memory. Without the singers, the hymns fall silent. Without the scribes, the omens scatter. Without the temple staff, the divine household becomes an abandoned room. That is not a statement of disbelief. It is a statement about preservation. Power that enters history must be maintained by historical beings. The imagined temple quiets as night gathers. The outer court empties. A lamp remains near a doorway, somewhere inside. A final portion is set before the god. The city beyond the walls exhales, animals settling, family speaking softly, water tapping at a canal bank, a watchman calling in the distance. The priests have done what the day required. Tomorrow they will do it again, and in that repetition lies both devotion and fragility. The gods remain above, yet their earthly nearness is held together by hands, voices, oil, grain, incense, clay, and memory. If control still exists, it has become a ritual art. If absence has begun, ritual covers the gap with music. The temple does not declare which is true. It only keeps the passage open a little longer. At the edges of Mesopotamian memory, the figures become harder to name. They are not always gods, not always humans, not always monsters in the simple sense. They appear as sages, guardians, hybrids, creatures of wisdom, beings dressed in fish skins, figures standing beside sacred trees, and strange forms carved into seals and palace walls. They belong to the borderland where knowledge becomes image and image becomes warning. You approach them slowly because they do not explain themselves. The most curious among them are often called apkallu, ancient sages associated in later Mesopotamian tradition with wisdom from before the flood. Some are linked with legendary kings. Some appear in art as human figures with fish-like cloaks or bird-like features. They are not exactly the same across every period or text, but they gather around the idea of old knowledge, protective power, and contact between human order and something older. Their presence is quiet but persistent. In grounded scholarship, the Apkallu belonged to Mesopotamian myth, ritual, and learned tradition. They were associated with wisdom, protection, and ancient authority. In later Assyrian art, similar protective beings appear in palaces, sometimes shown holding ritual objects, standing near sacred trees, or guarding thresholds. They helped mark royal space as protected and cosmically ordered. But the idea of pre-flood sages makes the air shift. If the flood was a rupture, then beings remembered from before it become carriers of a world that should have vanished. They are not merely decorative. They suggest continuity across catastrophe, a thread of knowledge passing through water, kingship, ritual, and scribal memory. Ancient people did not imagine wisdom as beginning fresh after disaster. They imagined it as inherited from a deep, half-hidden age. That is the attention peak. The oldest wisdom is often described as surviving from the very age the flood was supposed to close. You stand now in the shadow of a palace relief. The stone is cool in the mind, unlike the heat outside. A winged figure faces a sacred tree. His beard is arranged with impossible care. In one hand he holds a small bucket. In another, he may hold a cone-shaped object used in ritual scenes. The image is formal, still and watchful. It feels less like a portrait than a function. The figure guards a boundary. Ancient art loved boundaries, doorways, gateways, palace walls, temple entrances, and city gates were not empty spaces. They were vulnerable places where inside and outside touched. Protective beings stood there in image and ritual, reminding every passer-by that order had edges, and edges needed guardians. That is a deeply practical spirituality. A city worries about invasion. A palace worries about betrayal. A temple worries about impurity. A household worries about illness, misfortune, and unseen forces. Protective figures and rituals turn fear into arrangement. They give danger a place to be addressed. Yet the forms themselves remain strange. Fish-cloaked sages especially have drawn enormous modern attention. Some fringe interpreters describe them as memories of advanced visitors, teachers from the sea, or beings who brought civilization after a catastrophe. They compare them with myths of culture bringers from other ancient traditions, sometimes far too quickly. In these readings, the Apkallu become evidence of a lost teaching class linked to the Anunnaki or to a pre-flood order. A careful reading pauses. The texts and images do not support such claims as established history. The fish cloak may connect with ritual purity, the watery wisdom of Enki, or symbolic access to the Abzu, the deep freshwater source beneath the earth. The protective figures belong to known Mesopotamian religious and royal contexts. Their strangeness does not require a literal non-human origin. Still, symbols become powerful because they compress many meanings. A fish-cloaked sage can be ritual specialist, mythic ancestor, guardian, wisdom bearer, and memory of before the flood at once. Ancient categories were not narrow. They didn't need to choose between sacred image, political protection, and cosmic history. A figure could hold all of them, quietly, without apology. You hear footsteps in a palace corridor. The air smells of cedar, dust, oil, and stone. A servant passes beneath carved wings. A court official walks quickly with a tablet case. The king's world is organized, guarded, and watched by images from older myth. Power surrounds itself with beings older than its own dynasty. That choice reveals something. Human kings wanted ancient guardians near them. Not only current gods, not only living soldiers. They wanted figures that seemed to stand between time periods, carrying wisdom from before ordinary history. The king's authority became stronger when framed by beings whose memory reached into the deep past. Here the theme of control turns again. If divine order once moved through gods, then through kings, temples, scribes, and rituals. These border figures show another layer, controlled memory of the non-human or more than human past. The palace displays them, the rituals invoke them, the texts classify them. What was strange becomes a part of official order, but official order never fully tames strangeness. The Apkallu remain unsettling because they are too old. They remind the viewer that wisdom may not have started with the present city, present king, or present priesthood. They point backward to a time when knowledge was closer to divine sources, or at least imagined that way. They are signs that civilization believed it had inherited things it did not invent alone. Scholars debate how the Apkallu traditions developed. Were they originally wise men connected with legendary kings? Were they mythic culture heroes? Were they ritual figures later tied more strongly to protective magic? How did their pre-flood status develop? And how did later priests and scholars use them to authorize their own learning? The answers remain layered. Like so much in Mesopotamia, learned tradition looks backward in order to stand firmly in the present. A scribe gains authority by connecting his craft to ancient sages. A king gains authority by surrounding himself with protective figures from deep time. A ritual gains force by claiming old roots. The older the source, the heavier the power feels. That may be why the monsters at the edges are not merely monsters. They are memory guardians. Some figures associated with Mesopotamian myth are more threatening. Scorpion beings, lion-headed creatures, demons of illness, winds of destruction, and composite forms that blur human and animal. They populate the margins where the ordered city meets wilderness, disease, night, and death. Yet even these beings can be managed through names, images, amulets, and rituals. The unknown is not erased. It is catalogued. That is another quiet spark. Mesopotamian culture often handled fear by naming it, drawing it, and placing it within a system. A demon could be terrifying, but if its name was known and its ritual response preserved, then terror became at least partially workable. The world was filled with danger, but danger could be addressed through learned practice. Control, again, becomes knowledge, but knowledge has a shadow. If humans learn the names of hidden beings, learn protective rituals, and preserve the signs of ancient sages, then they gain access to layers of the sacred system once reserved for divine or semi-divine figures. A priest who knows the correct incantation can act in spaces where ordinary people cannot. A scribe who copies a ritual text becomes a human carrier of boundary power. This is not rebellion by force. It is participation by learning. You imagine a ritual tablet laid near a lamp. Its surface holds instructions against harm. The text may invoke gods, sages, purifying substances, and gestures older than the current generation. The person reading it does not invent the power. He channels a tradition. Yet the tradition survives only because human hands keep copying it. Even the guardians need preservation. As night falls beyond the palace wall, protective figures remain in the dark. Their carved eyes do not close. Their wings do not move. Their fish cloaks do not dry or decay. They stand where the king wanted cosmic order to be visible, where fear could be shaped into stone. But the silence around them is not empty. It is filled with questions that remain deliberately soft. Were these beings remembered as mythic ancestors of wisdom? Were they ritual masks for priestly roles? Were they symbols of knowledge from the watery deep? Or did later imagination preserve, in their hybrid bodies, a feeling that civilization had once been instructed by something it could no longer meet directly? No answer settles completely. The figures keep their watch, and perhaps that is their true power. They do not explain the past, they keep the past from becoming ordinary. They stand at the edge of the human story, reminding you that the oldest records do not only contain gods and kings, they also contain watchers, sages, guardians, and forms too strange to domesticate fully. The city sleeps behind its walls. At the threshold, older knowledge remains awake. The first sign of withdrawal is not disappearance, it is distance. In Mesopotamian laments, the gods do not always die, and they do not always speak in thunder. Sometimes they leave. A city falls because its divine protection has lifted. A temple becomes silent because its god has departed. Streets once crowded with offerings, music, bargaining, and ritual movement become spaces where wind carries dust through empty gates. That image is softer than destruction, and somehow worse. You feel it in the quiet after a ruined city has stopped smoking. The walls stand in broken places. The temple courtyard is open to the sky. A door hangs wrong. A storage jar lies cracked, its contents long gone. The smell is not only ash, it is old mud, dry reeds, weathered plaster, and the faint bitterness of a place no longer maintained. The god's house has become a house without presence. Mesopotamian city laments are some of the most haunting texts from the ancient world. They mourn destroyed cities such as Nippur, and others through religious poetry, political memory, and communal grief. These laments often describe divine abandonment as part of catastrophe. The city is not merely conquered, its cosmic order has been withdrawn. This is grounded in real historical pain. Cities were destroyed by war, political collapse, environmental strain, and shifting power. Temples could be looted, people could be displaced, dynasties could fall. The laments gave language to devastation by placing it inside a divine framework. If a sacred city could be ruined, then the community needed a way to understand how such a thing could happen. The answer was often painful. The gods had left. But why would they leave? That question trembles behind the poetry. The texts may describe decisions made by higher gods, anger over offence, fate decreed in the divine assembly, or the tragic movement of destiny. Yet beneath the theology lies a human wound. People had believed the city was protected, then the city fell. The gap between belief and ruins had to be crossed somehow. A lament is one way to cross it. You hear a singer in a broken sanctuary. The voice is low, trained, and tired. The song does not rush. It names the city as if naming could gather the pieces. It remembers streets, temples, gates, and people. It speaks of the goddess, or God leaving like a parent forced from a child, or like a ruler abandoning a throne. The grief is formal, but not cold. Here is the quiet attention peak. The gods who once seemed to manage everything can also appear unable or unwilling to stop collapse. That does not mean Mesopotamians stopped believing. Often the opposite is true. The lament preserves faith by explaining disaster through divine decision. If a city falls, it is not because the gods are unreal. It is because the gods have judged, withdrawn, or allowed fate to proceed. The sacred order remains, even when human eyes see only rubble. But the emotional effect is still profound. Divine control begins to feel remote. The earlier myths imagined gods assigning labour, granting powers, sending floods, preserving survivors, and authorising kingship. In the laments, divine agency is present, but often through absence. The gods are powerful enough to leave, but their leaving exposes how fragile the city always was. Protection was not a wall, it was a relationship, and relationships can break. Mainstream scholarship reads city laments as ritual and literary responses to historical catastrophes, especially events like the fall of Ur around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. They may have been performed in ceremonial context to process loss, restore order, and frame political transition. They also show the deep connection between city identity and divine presence. The speculative edge appears in the pattern of withdrawal. Some modern readers wonder whether these laments preserve a memory of the gods becoming less directly involved with humanity. The divine powers do not vanish at once. They retreat into ritual, omen, dream, and memory. Instead of walking plainly through the world of mythic beginnings, they are encountered through absence, signs, and longing. This is not a historical conclusion, but as a narrative movement, it is powerful. The gods who create, assign, and intervene become gods who must be summoned, appeased, mourned, and remembered. Humanity remains in the cities, writing more than ever, while divine presence becomes less stable, less visible, less easily held. You can feel this in abandoned sacred space. A temple without ritual is not only an old building, it is a broken connection. The daily offerings stop, the songs stop, the doors are no longer purified. The god statue may have been carried away, destroyed, hidden, or ritually removed. The human systems that sustain divine nearness have failed, and with them, the city's confidence. If control depends on maintenance, abandonment is disaster. The open scholarly uncertainty lies in how literally to read divine departure in these texts. Were there laments describing cult statues being removed from conquered cities? Were they using poetic language for political collapse? Were they expressing theological ideas about divine anger and fate? Were they part of rituals meant to invite restoration? Several answers may be true together. Ancient texts often work like lamplight on water. Each angle shows another surface. A god's departure can be a political metaphor, a ritual crisis, a theological explanation, and an emotional truth. A city whose temple has gone silent really has lost a form of life. The silence itself becomes evidence. You move through that silence as dusk gathers. Dust lies in corners where offerings once rested. A broken cylinder seal is half buried near a wall. Bats shift above a doorway. A reed mat has rotted into the floor. In the distance, someone may still remember the festival route, but no procession walks it tonight. Memory remains, but the system has stopped moving. This is where humanity's persistence becomes almost unsettling. Even when gods withdraw, humans keep naming them. They write laments. They restore temples. They compose prayers asking the absent god to return. They rebuild houses for divine presence, as if architecture could persuade heaven to come back. Perhaps sometimes it could, at least within the ancient worldview. Restoration mattered. A king who rebuilt a temple was not simply repairing property. He was reopening relationship. He was inviting the god to return, placing the city again under sacred protection. The act was political, devotional, and psychological all at once. The builder becomes a negotiator with absence. This adds another layer to the theme of control. If the gods can withdraw, humans can also respond. They can lament. They can rebuild. They can perform rituals of return. They can preserve the name of the departed power so that abandonment does not become forgetting. Loss does not end the relationship. It changes the work required to sustain it. Somewhere in a later archive, a scribe copies a city lament long after the immediate disaster has passed. He may live under different rulers. He may speak a different daily language. The city mourned in the poem may already be layered under centuries of rebuilding and decay. Yet he copies the grief carefully, sign by sign. That act is gentle resistance against disappearance. The gods may leave the city, but humans do not let the departure vanish. They turn absence into literature. They make sorrow teachable. They allow future generations to feel the moment when divine protection failed or withdrew. In doing so, they preserve not only reverence, but also the memory of divine distance. This is a strange power. A god's absence becomes known because humans record it. The night grows cooler around the ruined precinct. Stars appear above broken walls. The river continues somewhere beyond the dark. It does not pause for the city's grief. A fox moves through a collapsed doorway. Wind touches the remains of an altar. The world has not ended, but something central has gone quiet. The old stories do not say plainly that the gods lost control. They offer something more haunting. They show a world where control becomes harder to see. It becomes ritual instead of direct presence, lament instead of command, omen instead of conversation, memory instead of certainty. The gods remain great, but their nearness flickers. Humanity remains small, but its writing grows patient. In that patient writing, absence itself is kept alive. The city sleeps in ruins. The divine name still lingers above it, faint as smoke, carried by voices that refuse to let silence have the final word. When the gods grow distant, the tablets become more important. Clay begins to do what presence no longer does easily. It holds names, it holds laments, it holds instructions, offerings, omens, hymns, to your royal claims, and old stories that might otherwise fade into the breath of dead singers. A tablet cannot replace a god, but it can preserve the shape of a world that once believed the god was near. You feel that shift in the archive. The room is not grand in the way a palace hall is grand. It is smaller, dimmer, more practical. Baskets lean against walls. Shelves hold tablets stacked by purpose. School exercise, legal record, hymn, omen, calculation, lexical list, ritual instruction. The air is dry. A little dust hangs in the lamplight. Every object seems ordinary until you remember what it carries. This is where human memory becomes disciplined. Writing did not simply record information, it trained attention. A scribe had to learn signs, languages, formulas, traditions, and the habits of careful copying. In Mesopotamia, scribal culture preserved Sumerian long after it was no longer the everyday spoken language for most people. The old tongue became learned, sacred, prestigious, and durable. That is a remarkable survival. A dead or fading language can become more powerful through schools, in grounded historical terms. This is part of the long life of Mesopotamian learned culture. Scribes copied Sumerian and Akkadian texts across centuries. They preserved lexical lists, myths, proverbs, incantations, mathematical exercises, and omen collections. Their work was not romantic, it was demanding, repetitive, and tied to institutions. But repetition made memory stable. The world was preserved by homework. There's a small, gentle smile in that. The divine names that seem so large to us often survived because a tired student copied them correctly enough. A hymn endured because a teacher assigned it. A myth crossed generations because scribal tradition valued it. The high language of gods and kings depended on human discipline, human error, human correction, and human patience. This is not the overthrow of heaven. It is stranger. It is dependence through preservation. The quiet attention peak lies here. The gods who once gave order to humans now rely on human archives to remain audible to the future. Not in the ancient believers' immediate world, perhaps, but in the long view available to you now. Without clay, much of their speech would be gone. Without scribes, the Anunnaki would be far dimmer names. You sit beside an apprentice as he practices. His stylus presses a sign, then another. He makes a mistake and smooths the clay with his thumb. His teacher may scold him. Outside, the city continues without noticing the cosmic importance of this small embarrassment. Grain is weighed, water is drawn, bread is baked. Someone bargains too loudly near a doorway. Inside, the past is being copied. A strange uncertainty surrounds every copied text. Is the scribe preserving an old tradition faithfully, or reshaping it without realizing? Is a damaged tablet restored from memory, analogy, or guesswork? Did a school tradition simplify an older myth for teaching? Did local theology alter a story to fit its city's god? The clay survives, but it doesn't guarantee stillness. Every copy is also an interpretation. This matters deeply for the mystery. If we ask whether Sumerian records reveal gods losing control, we are not listening to a single witness. We are listening through layers of scribal activity. The records themselves are human artifacts. Even divine speech arrives through human selection, education, and preservation. That does not make them false. It makes them alive. A temple hymn may preserve theology. It may also preserve a performance tradition. A royal inscription may honour a god. It may also strengthen the king. A myth may remember ancient religious ideas. It may also carry the humour, politics, and imagination of scribes who shaped the version we read. Humanity does not merely receive the stories. Humanity handles them. This is where some fringe readers become fascinated by the archive as a hidden inheritance. They imagine ancient scribes guarding fragments of knowledge from a time when divine or Anunnaki beings instructed humanity. In this view, the tablets are not just literature or bureaucracy, but broken remains of a guided civilization, coded in mythic language after direct contact faded. A careful reading keeps the mystery responsible. There's no need to claim the tablets are secret technical manuals. Their known contexts are already rich enough. They belong to ancient schools, temples, palaces, households, legal systems, and ritual practices. Their meaning must be approached through language, archaeology, comparison, and caution. Yet the feeling of inheritance is real. The scribes themselves often valued antiquity. Old forms carried prestige. Ancient wisdom mattered. The more distant the origin of a tradition, the stronger its authority could feel. A text connected to legendary sages, early kings, or divine instruction was not merely old, it was weighty. Age was a form of power. You can feel this in the copying of omen texts. Signs observed in the world were gathered into patterns. If this occurs, that may follow a birth anomaly, a liver marking, a celestial event, a dream, an unusual animal behaviour, all could enter a learned system. To modern minds, this may seem like superstition. To the ancient scholar, it was an attempt to read order in uncertainty. The archive became a map of possible futures, but maps can trap their makers. Once signs are collected, classified, and copied, the world begins to look readable in a particular way. Humans become skilled interpreters of divine messages. They do not control fate, yet they gain power by knowing how to respond to its hints. The gods speak through signs, but human specialists decide what those signs mean. Control again passes through interpretation, and interpretation is never neutral. A king may receive an omen reading that shapes a campaign. A ritual may be performed to avert danger. A temple may gain authority because its scholars know the old series. A royal court may depend on experts who can turn ambiguity into advice. Divine communication becomes part of human decision-making. That is not a clean loss of control. It is a shared, unstable system. The gods send signs, or are believed to. Humans read them. Humans argue over them. Humans archive them. Humans teach them. Over time, the machinery of divine communication grows more elaborate, and every elaboration creates more human expertise. The creation learns not only to work, it learns to interpret. This may be the most important step in the long, quiet transformation. Labour can be commanded, speech can be discouraged, cities can be punished. But interpretation is harder to contain. Once humans begin asking what the gods mean, not only what the gods demand, they enter a deeper kind of participation. They become readers of heaven. The archive at night feels almost like a second sky. Signs cluster in rows like stars, each one meaningful only to the trained eye. A student sees difficulty, a master sees pattern, a future archaeologist sees fragments. You see the slow accumulation of human attempts to keep divine order from vanishing into silence. There is an open debate in scholarship about literacy itself. How many people could read? How specialized was scribal knowledge? How did oral performance and written preservation interact? The world of tablets was not a world where everyone read freely. Literacy was limited, trained, and tied to status. Yet even limited literacy can reshape a civilization. A few hands can preserve many voices. That fact makes the archive powerful, not democratic in any modern sense, not free from hierarchy, but durable. A text stored in clay can sleep for centuries. It can disappear beneath rubble. It can be found when the language is almost forgotten. It can force later people to learn the dead signs again. The gods become readable after long silence because humans once wrote them. You move toward the doorway of the archive. The night outside is quiet, but not empty. The temple lamp still burns somewhere nearby. A dog barks once and stops. The river insects sing beyond the walls. Inside, the tablets rest with the patience of stones. No god speaks aloud, yet the shelves are full of divine names. This is how the human counterforce grows, not by rejecting the sacred, but by preserving it so stubbornly that even absence cannot erase it. The created beings become the memory keepers of their creators. The servants of divine order become the custodians of divine story. The noise that troubled heaven becomes writing that outlasts cities, and in the cool dark, clay waits for hands that have not yet been born. Memory is not loud at first. It begins as a mark, a repeated sign, a name someone refuses to let vanish. It begins with a student pressing wedges into clay, with a priest reciting old words at dawn, with a king carving his restoration into brick, with a family remembering which god protected their house. It begins as care, then becomes inheritance. An inheritance changes the creation. If humanity was imagined as made for labour, then memory is the quiet excess no labour system can fully contain. A worker can dig a canal. A servant can carry grain. A singer can perform at a temple. But a being who remembers begins to compare. A being who compares begins to wonder. A being who wonders begins to ask whether the present order was always the only possible one. This is not rebellion in the sharp sense. It is slower than rebellion. It is consciousness gathering around its own traces. Mesopotamia gives you some of the earliest surviving examples of this process in written form. People did not only record goods and offerings, they preserved myths of creation, flood, kingship, city destruction, divine anger, sacred love, heroic failure, and the search for life beyond death. They made law collections, proverbs, school exercises, hymns, prayers, incantations, and laments. Human experience became arranged in clay. That arrangement is a form of power. You stand in a scribal school where afternoon heat leans heavily against the walls. The students are not glamorous. Their backs ache. Their fingers are marked with damp clay. A teacher speaks a line, and the line is repeated. The room smells of dust, sweat, reed stylus, and sun-warmed mud brick. Somewhere outside, a donkey complains with the sincerity of an unpaid official. The old world remains practical, yet inside that practicality, something immense is happening. A young scribe learns not only how to count grain, but how to enter an inherited mind. He learns signs older than his own family line. He learns divine names, city names, professions, plants, stones, stars, and stories. He learns that the world can be held in lists. Lists may seem dull. They are not. A list is a way of refusing chaos. It gathers scattered things and places them in order. Mesopotamian lexical lists trained scribes to organize knowledge through categories. They listed objects, animals, occupations, geographic names, and signs. To copy such lists was to practice a view of reality where the world could be named, sorted, and remembered. Here is the attention peak. A creation that can name the world has already stepped beyond simple service. Naming does not equal freedom, but it changes the relationship. If the gods once assigned roles, humans now record those roles. If cities belong to gods, humans list the cities. If kingship descends from heaven, humans place kings in sequence. If omens reveal divine intention, humans collect and interpret them. The world is still sacred, but it becomes increasingly readable through human systems. Control becomes entangled with classification. This is why writing may be humanity's deepest mythic rebellion. Though the word rebellion must remain soft, it does not deny the gods. It preserves them. It does not break the temple. It keeps the temple's accounts. It does not silence royal power. It carves royal power into stone. But preservation can outgrow obedience, because preserved things can be revisited, compared, questioned, and reinterpreted. A tablet is patient enough to become dangerous. The ancient scribes may not have intended danger. Many served institutions loyally. They wrote for temples, palaces, merchants, families, and courts. They worked inside hierarchy. But history often changes meaning without asking permission. A record made to support authority may later reveal its fragility. A royal boast may outlive the dynasty it celebrated. A lament meant to restore faith may preserve the memory of divine absence. Memory has its own weather. Some modern fringe readers sense this and imagine ancient writing as a stolen or inherited tool from higher beings. They connect scribal knowledge with the Anunnaki, the Apkallu, or pre-flood wisdom, suggesting that humans receive the mechanism of memory from those who once managed them. This remains speculative and should be treated carefully. The grounded view is enough to hold wonder. Writing emerged from human needs and human invention within complex societies. It developed through accounting, administration, symbol use, and institutional practice. Yet once writing existed, it transformed the very humanity that made it. The practical tool became a vessel for myth, law, prayer, mathematics, and self-reflection. A clay receipt opened the door to immortality of a modest kind. Not bodily immortality, not divine life. A name could last. That was already enormous. You feel this in the literature of kings. Rulers repeatedly sought lasting names. They built temples, walls, canals, and monuments, then wrote about them. Their bodies would die, but their inscriptions asked the future to remember. Even when the language changed, even when the cities fell, the desire remained visible. The human answer to mortality was not only grief, it was documentation. Gilgamesh becomes especially important here, not because he solves death, but because he fails to solve it. His story turns toward the city walls, toward human work that can endure longer than human breath. The lesson is not simple acceptance. It is a shift from impossible immortality to remembered achievement. That shift feels very Mesopotamian. The gods remain beyond ordinary human reach. The survivor of the flood remains an exception. The king must return home. The walls still stand. The story is then written down, copied, and read across ages the hero could never imagine. In losing the search for eternal life, Gilgamesh gains another kind of survival through text. A literary failure becomes cultural victory. This creates another scholarly uncertainty. How did audiences in different periods understand such stories? Did they hear primarily royal ideology, wisdom literature, entertainment, theology, school tradition, or meditation on death? Modern categories divide what ancient listeners may have received together. A story could comfort, instruct, legitimize, and unsettle all at once. The clay allows multiple echoes. You move from the schoolroom into a street at dusk. The city glows in amber dust. Traders close their stalls. Smoke rises from ovens. A child traces marks in the ground with a stick, not yet a scribe, but already imitating the human impulse to leave a line behind. Above the rooftops, the first stars appear. The stars were old before the city learned their names. Humans name them anyway. That's the gentle astonishment at the centre of this whole mystery. Whether or not the old myths hide memories of lost control, they clearly preserve a world where humans became keepers of patterns. They watched the sky, tracked seasons, measured fields, counted goods, listed words, preserved divine names, and asked what disaster meant. They became creatures of record. A worker can be commanded. A record keeper can remember the command. A storyteller can ask why it was given. The gods in Mesopotamian tradition often remain powerful, but human memory makes them historically visible. The Anunnaki become known to you not because they step into your room, but because people long ago pressed signs into clay. The divine assembly survives through human craft. Even speculation about lost control depends on the records made by the supposed creation. That is the deepest irony, soft enough for sleep. If humans were created to serve, they eventually served by preserving the very stories that make the creators questionable. They preserved divine greatness, but also divine frustration. They preserved authority, but also argument. They preserved the flood, but also the loophole that saved life. They preserved kingship descending from heaven, but also the human kings who used it, lost it, and tried to make their names last. Memory does not obey one master forever. Night settles fully now. In the archive, tablets cool in darkness. In the temple, a lamp burns low. In the street, voices fade. The city becomes quieter, though never silent. Somewhere, a scribe's last tablet of the day rests beside others, still damp enough to hold the trace of his thumb. It is a small human mark, almost nothing, yet such marks are why the ancient world still speaks. The creation learns memory, and memory becomes the softest form of defiance. Not a shout against heaven, but a patient refusal to disappear. Not certainty, but preservation. Not proof of every mystery, but evidence that humans became more than labour. They became witnesses, and a witness, once written into clay, can keep asking questions long after the gods have stopped answering aloud. The broken machine is not found in one tablet. It is found in the way many fragments seem to fit near one another without ever locking completely into place. A creation story speaks of labour. A flood story speaks of noise. A king list speaks of rule before catastrophe. A city hymn speaks of divine favour. A lament speaks of abandonment. A ritual text tries to hold the passage open. An omen collection listens for messages in the strange behaviour of the world. None of these pieces proves the whole design. Together, they create the feeling of a system. You approach that system carefully, as if kneeling beside scattered parts on a floor. Some pieces are solid and well understood. Archaeology shows cities, temples, tablets, canals, seals, workshops, graves, walls, and layers of rebuilding. History shows dynasties rising and falling. Philology gives you words, names, grammar, and the slow recovery of vanished languages. Comparative mythology shows shared themes moving across cultures. Other pieces remain uncertain. A broken line, a missing tablet, a name used differently across centuries, a god whose role shifts from city to city, a myth copied long after the tradition behind it first formed, a number so enormous it stops behaving like ordinary history, an image on a seal that seems clear until you try to explain it. The past resists assembly. That resistance is part of its truth. Mainstream scholarship does not need a hidden civilization to explain Mesopotamia's greatness. Human communities developed agriculture, irrigation, urban life, writing, trade, law, literature, and complex religion through long processes. These processes were uneven, experimental, and deeply local. They involved environment, labour, invention, rivalry, memory, and institutions. That picture is strong. It is also full of wonder. You do not need to erase human achievement to feel mystery in the tablets. In fact, the more grounded the evidence becomes, the stranger humanity appears. These people built cities from river mud. They taught clay to remember voices. They created institutions powerful enough to coordinate fields, temples, and kings. They imagined gods as administrators, judges, lovers, warriors, parents, and distant rulers. They turned anxiety into ritual. The human world was already astonishing, yet the myths give that world a shadow. They suggest that civilization was not experienced merely as invention from below. It felt received, assigned, descended, taught, stolen, restored, and sometimes withdrawn. The people who created these stories often placed their own achievements inside a larger sacred order, as if the machinery of life had been handed to them from somewhere higher. That is the key. Whether the gods were understood as divine beings, city powers, cosmic principles, or mythic forms of authority, they represented an order older and greater than individual humans. To live well was to align with it. To rule well was to serve it. To build well was to restore it. To write well was to preserve it. Then the fragments begin to tremble together. Humans are made to relieve labour. Humans multiply into disturbing noise. Divine powers are distributed through the me. Kingship descends, moves, vanishes, and descends again. A flood interrupts the world but fails to erase it. Priests maintain divine nearness through ritual. Scribes preserve divine memory. Laments record the pain of absence. Sages and guardians stand at thresholds like fragments of older knowledge. This is not a straight line. It is a pattern of pressure. The quiet attention peak lies in one uncomfortable possibility. If you read the myths as symbolic memory, then divine control is never shown as perfectly stable. It is constantly being organized, repaired, negotiated, transferred, or mourned. The gods rule, but they argue. They create, but regret. They assign powers, but powers move. They send destruction, but warning escapes. They authorize kings, but kings fall. They dwell in temples, but may depart. That is the broken machine. Not a literal machine of metal and light, a mythic machine of order, labour, authority, memory, ritual, and fear. It works only if every part holds. Gods, cities, kings, priests, scribes, workers, offerings, canals, signs, names, and stories. When one part shifts, the whole system strains. You can almost hear it creaking softly beneath the clay. Some modern fringe interpretations take this pattern as evidence that the Anunnaki were real external rulers who engineered humanity, managed early civilization, and then lost control of their creation. These interpretations often move faster than the evidence allows. They may flatten poetic texts into technical reports or ignore the known context of ancient literature. Responsible reading slows down. The tablets do not confirm such claims. They do not give a clean historical record of non-human administrators. They give myth, theology, ritual, politics, memory, and literature. But those forms are not empty. They preserve how ancient people imagined power, origin, dependence, and catastrophe. They show that humans once told stories in which their own existence troubled the powers that made them. That alone is quietly unsettling. You sit with the reconstructed pattern beneath the night sky. The river is dark. The stars appear sharp above the plain. Somewhere in the distance, a settlement mound rises like a sleeping animal. Beneath it may be walls, floors, ashes, potsherds, tablets, bones, ceilings, and forgotten rooms. Archaeology does not uncover a single past. It uncovers stacked attempts to live. Each layer corrects and confuses the last. A temple built over a temple. a king naming himself restorer of what another king had built, a scribe copying an older sign whose original pronunciation may already be fading, a myth retold in another language, a city destroyed, rebuilt, renamed, and remembered as if continuity were both fact and prayer. The machine is broken because time breaks everything, but it is also broken because the human record lets you see the repairs. A perfect system leaves no seams. Mesopotamian tradition is full of seams. The gods have councils because decisions are not simple. Floods have survivors because destruction is not complete. Kings need inscriptions because authority must be declared again and again. Temples need rituals because presence must be renewed. Archives need copies because memory can fail. The seams are where the mystery breathes. Scholars remain divided on many details, not because the field is careless, but because the evidence is difficult. Ancient texts survive unevenly. Languages changed. Sites were excavated under different methods across different eras. Some tablets are unprovenanced. Some remain unpublished. Some lines are reconstructed with caution. Certainty is rare, and humility is part of the work. That humility suits the knight. You do not have to force a final answer from the fragments. A softer question may be more faithful to them. What did ancient Mesopotamians feel about the powers that shape civilization? Did they experience human life as a gift, burden, mistake, duty, experiment, or all of these together? Did myths of divine frustration express fear that society had become too complex for anyone, god or king, to fully master? That last question feels especially human. Every civilization builds systems larger than its builders: irrigation networks, temple economies, royal courts, trade routes, legal customs, scribal schools, and mythic traditions all begin through human action, then become structures that shape later humans. Once formed, they seem to stand above ordinary life. They feel almost divine. Perhaps the gods in these stories are not losing control only of humans. Perhaps they are losing control of civilization itself. This is not a claim. It is a careful reading held at the edge of sleep. The divine administrators create order. The order grows. The order requires maintenance. The maintenance creates specialists. The specialists preserve memory. The memory allows comparison. Comparison allows doubt. Doubt allows new stories. The machine keeps moving, even when no one fully controls it. You imagine an ancient scholar lifting a tablet from a shelf, checking the first line, and setting it near a lamp. He does not think of us. He does not think of modern theories, museums, subtitles, or late-night listeners half asleep in another age. He thinks of his work. He thinks of the signs. He thinks of correctness, tradition, and perhaps the favour of powers whose names he writes carefully. Still, his work becomes part of a future he cannot manage. That is the final reversal hidden inside the archive. The records meant to preserve order become records through which later minds question order. The myths meant to honour divine authority become myths through which people wonder whether authority ever fully held. The tablets meant to serve tradition become fragments that reopen the mystery. Clay does not choose its readers. It only waits. The river keeps moving in darkness. The mound keeps its buried rooms. The stars hold their cold positions over a land that has changed names many times. Somewhere beneath the soil, a tablet may still carry a broken line about gods, humans, kingship, flood, or silence. You do not need the line to be complete. The incompleteness is part of the message. If the old records suggest anything, they suggest that creation was never a finished command. It was a relationship under strain, a system under repair, a story repeatedly copied because no generation could settle it entirely. The gods may have ruled the beginning, but humanity learned to carry the record. And once the record is carried by the creation itself, The machine belongs partly to the hands that keep rebuilding it. The final command, if it ever existed, is not preserved in a complete line. That may be the most fitting ending for a story made from clay. The oldest records do not give you a clean confession. They do not say plainly that the gods lost control of their creation. They do not open like a sealed chamber and reveal one hidden answer waiting for a modern reader. They offer fragments, repetitions, contradictions, formal poems, king lists, rituals, laments, and stories copied through centuries of human hands. The mystery remains indirect. You come to it now not as someone looking for a single proof, but as someone listening for a pattern. In the pattern, the gods make, assign, guide, regret, punish, spare, withdraw, and are remembered. Humans labour, multiply, build, suffer, serve, write, interpret, rebuild, and remember. No one in the story remains still. Even heaven changes shape when humans learn to keep records. The grounded history remains essential. Ancient Mesopotamia was one of the earliest great centres of urban civilization. Its people created cities, writing, temple economies, kingship, mathematical systems, legal traditions, literature, and ritual worlds of extraordinary depth. These achievements came from human communities adapting to rivers, fields, labour, trade, conflict, and memory over long periods. Nothing about that needs to be diminished. The mystery is not stronger if human beings become passive. It is stronger because they do not. The old myths describe humans as made for service, yet the historical record shows humans becoming creators of systems themselves. They did not merely carry baskets and offerings. They built institutions, measured land, tracked stars, preserved languages, composed epics, mourned cities, judged disputes, and placed divine names into archives. The supposed creation became a maker of worlds within the world. That is the quiet attention peak. The creation becomes creative enough to remember its creators. This is why the Anunnaki mystery endures, not because every modern theory about them is proven, and not because the tablets secretly contain a simple alternative history. The endurance comes from the strange way Mesopotamian texts portray divine order as active, administrative, anxious, and sometimes unstable. The gods do not merely float above existence. They manage, dispute, correct, and respond. That makes them feel closer than pure abstraction. It also makes them vulnerable to narrative pressure. A perfect god outside time cannot lose control in the way a ruler can. But Mesopotamian gods, as preserved in literature, often behave within relationships, councils, cities, and obligations. They have preferences, they have anger, they have favourites, they have conflicts. Their power is immense, but it is told through stories that make power dramatic, social, and sometimes troubled. You are not being asked to flatten faith into politics. You're only noticing that ancient stories use familiar structures to speak about the unfamiliar. Divine households resemble earthly households. Divine councils resemble royal courts. Divine decrees resemble administrative commands. Divine frustration resembles the anxiety of rulers facing crowds, cities, hunger, and noise. The gods are larger than humans, as told in humanly readable forms. That is the gift and the limitation of myth. Some have wondered whether these readable forms preserve memories of real beings, older teachers, or lost interventions. Such interpretations belong to the outer edge of the conversation. They can be imaginative and emotionally compelling, especially when they connect the Anunnaki with creation, labour, kingship, flood, and ancient knowledge. But they should not be treated as established fact. The clay asks for patience. A responsible reading allows mystery without surrendering caution. It says the texts may suggest patterns, but do not prove modern claims. It says ancient people were profound thinkers, not confused witnesses waiting for us to decode them. It says mythology can preserve social memory, environmental trauma, theological reflection, political ideology, and unresolved fear all at once. The old records are not simple, because life was not simple. You stand now in a museum gallery after closing, in the quiet imagination of night. The glass reflects faint lights. A tablet rests behind it, small and weathered. Its signs are sharp in places, softened in others. A label nearby gives a date, a site, a language, a museum number. These modern details are useful, but they cannot hold the whole weight of the object. The tablet was once touched by someone alive, someone who breathed dust, worried about mistakes, learned signs, and belonged to a city full of heat, prayer, work, and fear. That person may never have asked whether the gods lost control of humanity, yet his writing lets you ask it now. This is one of history's gentle impossibilities. The dead preserve questions for the unborn. The open scholarly uncertainty remains wide. How should we interpret creation myths that tie humanity to labour? How should we weigh pre-flood kings and impossible reigns? How much of the flood story reflects local environmental memory, inherited myth, or theological design? How did scribes reshape old traditions? How much did ordinary people know or believe about the learned texts copied in schools? Each question opens another room. None requires a shouted answer. A fringed tidbit, held carefully, is that some modern readers interpret the entire Mesopotamian mythic cycle as a memory of a controlled human project that became too unpredictable. The creation of workers, the complaint about noise, the flood as attempted reset, the survivor as loophole, and kingship as renewed control become, in that reading, stages of a failed management system. It is a compelling story, but perhaps the more grounded version is even deeper. Ancient people understood that civilization itself can escape simple control. You create canals, then must maintain them forever. You create kingship, then must fear bad kings. You create writing, then records outlive intention. You create cities, then cities grow beyond the comfort of the powers that founded them. The system always exceeds the designer. That may be the secret the tablets keep whispering. Not that one hidden event explains everything. Not that every god was a disguised engineer. Not that history has been locked away from you. Rather, the ancient stories preserve a permanent human fear that the powers shaping life, whether divine, royal, institutional, or human, may not fully master what they set in motion. Creation is dangerous because it continues. A child grows. A city expands. A story is copied. A ritual shifts meaning. A king's name becomes a broken brick. A god's absence becomes a hymn. A flood meant to silence becomes the most memorable sound in the archive. The command does not end the story. The story survives the command. You feel the final image forming slowly. Not a revelation, not a verdict, a tablet cooling in moonlight, a river moving beyond reeds, a ruined city mound beneath stars, a museum drawer sliding closed, a scribe's hand leaving its last print in clay. The divine names remain, but faintly, as if heard through walls. Maybe the gods did not lose control all at once. Maybe control thinned, passed into rituals, moved through kingship, hid in archives, and finally became something humans could study, question, and retell. Maybe the loss was not defeat, but diffusion. The old powers spread into institutions, stories, laws, and memories until no single hand could gather them back completely. That is only one reading, but it is a quiet one. It lets the record stay ancient, strange, and incomplete. It lets archaeology remain archaeology, myth remain myth, and speculation remain a lamp held at the edge rather than a fire consuming the room. It lets you drift between scholarship and mystery without needing to choose only one door. The Anunnaki in this telling are not reduced to proof or fantasy. They become part of a much older question about power, creation, and memory. What does a creator owe to what it creates? What happens when a servant becomes a witness? What remains of authority when the record is preserved by those once meant only to obey? The tablets do not answer. They wait, and perhaps waiting is their oldest form of speech, long after the cities fell, long after the temple songs faded, long after kingship moved through names and dynasties and dust. The clay kept its small, patient marks. It did not shout. It didn't explain itself fully. It simply carried enough of the old world for the question to rise again. What if the gods lost control of their creation? The safest answer is that we do not know. The more interesting answer is that the Sumerian and Mesopotamian records preserve a world deeply aware that creation, once released into time, cannot remain perfectly contained. Humans were made in myth for labor. They became makers of memory. They became the ones through whom the gods still speak. The last command is missing. The echo remains. Word count 1195. The night around the old tablets grows very still now. No new question needs to be opened. No hidden door needs to be forced. The clay has carried enough. The rivers have moved far enough through darkness. The cities have risen and fallen in the mind, leaving only the soft outline of walls, reeds, lamps, and dust. You can let the story loosen somewhere. Ancient clay cools beneath the moonlight. It no longer belongs to the hand that shaped it, or the school that copied it, or the temple that once held its words. It belongs to silence now, and to anyone quiet enough to listen without demanding that every broken line becomes certain. The river moves on. It passes ruined banks, sleeping reeds, buried bricks, and names no voice uses in the ordinary world. It carries silt, starlight, and the memory of rain. It does not explain the gods. It does not judge the people who feared them, served them, questioned them, and wrote them down. It simply moves, as rivers do. In the distance, a city mound rests under the dark. Inside it are rooms no one enters, floors no one sweeps, thresholds no one guards, and perhaps a tablet still waiting in the earth. Its signs may be broken, its ending may be gone, its most important word may be missing. Yet the missing word does not feel empty tonight. It feels like a place to sleep. Perhaps that is where the oldest mysteries belong, not solved into brightness, but left gently unread, like a final tablet on a shelf after the lamp has gone low. The gods fade into names, the names fade into clay, the clay fades into moonlit dust, and the question remains soft and unfinished, moving with the dark river while you drift farther from the waking world. End of script. Good night.